So we're starting 1 minute.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Should anyone, will anyone talk before me, or should I start right away introducing?
Yeah, sir. Sir, I will introduce you. On
Very
behalf of
good.
our organizing committee, I will introduce you.
Excellent. Thank you.
I am Dr. Partho Saruthi Mondal, Assistant Professor, Manmu Mahavidyalaya, and one of the editors of New Literaria, the
Yeah.
journal which has started its journey. And it is a seminar organized jointly by our journal and Assam University Silchar. So we are happy that already we have completed very successfully last 2 days, and this is the last day, third day, and this is the first session of the last day. So in this session, the chairman of this session is Dr. Albert Klassein. Dr. Klassein is University Distinguished Professor of German Studies at the University of Arizona, Tucson, where he is researching and teaching medieval and early modern literature and culture with a strong interest in creative writing, poetry, and contemporary literature. He is the current president of the Society of Contemporary American Literature in German. He has published number of books, scholarly books, 110 scholarly books, 730 articles, and at present, actually, he's working on or preparing a book on freedom, imprisonment, and slavery in the Middle Ages. Actually, with his studies, Middle Ages, its culture, its people, its society all come alive. So, and he's the editor of the journals Medievistic and Humanities. And in this session, we have two very distinguished professors, Dr. Gautam Basu Thakur and Dr. Robert Masterson. And the session, as I have already told, will be chaired by Dr. Albert Klassein. So most welcome you, sir. And now, you, sir, you please begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be part of this event. It is fantastic that we can really promote more international research. And so I really appreciate the invitation and the honor that I may chair our session today. I just don't want to spend too much time, but very quickly, our first speaker, Professor Thakur from Boise State University, is currently associate professor and director of critical theory. He has published at least two major studies, the one which really might concern us the most, Postcolonial Theory and Avatar 2015. And just this year, I think in March, he told me, Postcolonial Lack, Identity, Culture Surplus. He will talk about Fanon's ontology. So without further ado, thank you so much. I will be very anxious to hear what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Klassen, for the kind introduction, and a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this e-conference. A big thank you to Tonmoy for being able to convince me to join. There were some issues about which I was not being able to resolve earlier, but I'm very happy indeed that I am now part of this. I do not usually get an opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas with people back home, the home I left about 16, 17 years back. So I'm really thrilled to be addressing everyone back home. Since we're on a short lease time-wise, I would like to go directly to my paper. And the title of my paper is Fanon's Ontology. But I will not be speaking about Frantz Fanon's ontology per se. That is, I will not be attempting to psychoanalyze Fanon, produce a psychobiography of Fanon, something which was quite a rage in the 1960s and 70s. Instead, my intention would be to draw your attention to a theory of ontology that exists in the interstices of Fanon's first book, Black Skins, White Masks. Before moving forward, I wish to state two things. First, what I would be claiming as Fanon's singular contribution to the study of colonialism, namely examining the issues of colonialism, not in terms of social justice, that is identity and representation, but folding this into or getting this in a conversation with the question of ontology. This particular argument or claim that I'm making through a reading of Fanon is not immediately evident on the surface of Fanon's text. Any imminent reading of Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks has to reckon with Fanon's reliance, and some say over-reliance, on Sartrean humanism. It is only when we read in between the lines, that is, pursue what Stuart Hall calls a symptomatic reading of Fanon, that this aspect of Fanon's analysis of colonialism comes to the surface. Second, this paper is part of a larger work on Fanon that I have just started. But again, this larger work is not solely focused on Fanon, but it is an attempt to think with Fanon about both past and the present. So matters that concerns us in terms of the colonial past, as well as the post-colonial and now into the globalized present. In this paper, however, I will restrict my comments to two moments in Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. The first is a passage that's made up of just two sentences, and that comes early in the introduction of Black Skins, White Masks. And the second, I will be talking about the concept of blackness. And every time I say blackness in this paper, that B is capitalized. The concept of blackness, which is present in the 5th chapter of the book. All right. I'll not be using any PowerPoint, so I'll be reading out the quotes slowly. So I begin with that two-sentence passage that comes in the introduction, and it is as follows. There is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an incline stripped bare of every essential from which a genuine new departure can emerge. In most cases, the Black man lacks the advantage of being able to accomplish this descent into a real hell, close quotes. Appearing early in the introduction of Black Skin, White Masks, this poetically cryptic passage has puzzled Fanon's readers since the publication of the book in 1952. What is this zone of non-being? What relation does it have with the book's primary focus on examining psychological effects of colonialism on the colonized? And what does Fanon mean by, I quote, a genuine new departure can emerge from this stripped space if only the Black man or the colonized were to traverse its hellish depths? Habitual readings of Fanon have paid little attention to this passage, preferring instead to focus on the book's discussion of the effects of colonialism on the colonized psyche, that is the colonized's attempts to identify as white, hence the reference to the white mask in the title of the book, and the resulting loss or hybridization of an authentic native identity. This direction of thinking smoothly aligns Fanon's text with the post-colonial political project of rescuing and rehabilitating silenced and marginalized voices or identities. I wish to, however, move away from reading Fanon's text as an account of conflict between identities, that is white versus Black, and focus more on what I claim to be Fanon's most significant contribution to the study of colonialism, namely conceiving colonialism less in terms of social justice and identity politics, and more in relation to ontology. And I do this by focusing on the passage about the zone of non-being and the equally difficult to grasp concept of blackness. Now, I understand the zone of non-being as the inside-outside of the socio-symbolic, that is, what cannot be formalized in discourse, therefore existing as a stumble in discourse or within discourse's attempt at establishing correspondence between truth and knowledge. In other words, the zone is an ontologically irreducible space, a piece of the impossible real, if I can indulge in a bit of Lacan here, that while impossible to symbolize is yet always present as a deep haunting. It marks the fundamental antagonism structuring the social relations in the colony. Or it is the reason why there cannot be any communication between the colonizer and the colonized. Caught between an impossible desire to be white and an identity that does not exist, black, the colonized is the figure of this radical negativity. Or in the words of Peter Hudson, the negativity is, I quote, figured most positively through the colonized. By embodying this ontologically irreducible space, the colonized appears as the true measure of the colonial deadlock. Colonial societies are inherently non-relational and antagonistic, or to quote Homi Bhabha, an unresolved ensemble of antagonistic interlocutions, close quote. We must be cautious moving forward. To designate the colonizer-colonized non-relation as the fundamental condition of colonialism is not to repeat Kipling's maxim about the impossibility of communication between the East and the West. The irreducible antagonism between the colonizer and the colonized neither explains nor justifies colonialism as a project for rehabilitating the colonized to the center of Enlightenment Europe. For this would imply, from the colonizer's perspective, the necessity for rescuing, recreating, and reforming the colonized into the image of the colonizer, a historically violent and oppressive process. Similarly, from the perspective of the colonized, this does not suggest that once the colonized learns to speak or write back, she will be able to reclaim and or accommodate her particular identity against an Enlightenment universalism. Nor for that matter does this mean that when the colonized fully reverses the structures and discourses of colonialism by rediscovering its lost authentic pre-colonial past, that it will be completely free. We all know the dangers of such revivalisms undertaken in the name of nationalism and religion. Instead, I argue for understanding the radical antagonism structuring colonial social relations as an impossible deadlock. This impasse is the inherent non-logic structuring colonial society and colonial politics. And for this reason, it is not enough that the colonized defy or escape her racially and socially inferior position to the colonizer. Rather, the colonized must recognize her being as irrevocably divided between negations, that is, what it is not, black, and what it cannot be, white. Fanon's brilliance lies in his identification of the colonized as ontological void. And I quote from Fanon, "Man is not merely the possibility of recapture or of negation, uprooted, baffled, doomed to watch the dissolution of the truths he has worked out for himself. He has to give up projecting onto the world an antinomy that coexists within him," close quote. Seeking to express existence within quotes, that's from Fanon, the colonized only finds what Fanon calls the non-existent within quote, a referent that cannot be dialecticized. The colonized is therefore constitutively not. I stake this as the signature point of Black Skin, White Mask. In order to understand Fanon's analysis of colonialism, one must chart a course through the notion of the colonized as non-being or obstinate negativity. But two sentences appearing in the introduction, and it does not come, the zone of non-being does not appear anywhere in the black skin, white mask. And Fanon uses non-being, I think, only twice in the rest of the book. So these two sentences are not enough for fully developing a theory based or around the zone of non-being. Thankfully, further substantiation can be gleaned from the 5th chapter of the book titled The Fact of Blackness, and it has been titled differently elsewhere. Case of Blackness, the matter of the lived experience of the black man, etc. Interestingly, Fanon admits the outlier character of this chapter in the context of the book by noting in the introduction that while majority of the chapters in Black Skin, White Masks focuses on the colonized struggle to reach a promised, albeit impossible, white identity, the 5th chapter is different insofar it departs from examining the colonized's wish to be white to investigate the colonized's efforts at discovering her true identity over and beyond what has been imprinted on her by the colonizer. As I read it, this chapter shifts focus from examining the colonial socio-symbolic, the imaginary identities and symbolic discourses retaining these identities, to the impossible negativity existing between being white and remaining black, a paradox of which the colonized is a positive figuration. Fanon hammers home the point. There's no path out of this endgame. The colonized is, I quote, prisoner of a vicious cycle, close quote, destined to a life of constant denial, rejection, disillusionment, and overdetermination from the outside. Her lived experience cannot be reasoned. For as long as she is caught in the other's desire, she burns relentlessly in the crosshairs of the white gaze. Fanon writes, whiteness burns me to a cinder. She cannot be white, but she cannot be black either. If wanting to be white was a joke, Fanon's word joke, then I quote again from Fanon, wanting to be typically black is out of the question, close quote. This is especially so because Fanon unequivocally rejects the premise of an authentic black identity. Underlining the fictitious nature of such identities, he writes, and I quote, the discovery of the existence of a black civilization or a black philosopher who was in conversation with Plato confers no patent humanity on me. Like it or not, the past can in no way guide me in the present, close quote. Revivalism, or what Fanon phrases as rediscovering a black tradition, is only a defense mechanism. It substitutes one imaginary with another. Additionally, such efforts always get hijacked by the colonizer, as in the case with the negritude movement. Fanon explains, and I quote, when I tried to claim my negritude intellectually as a concept, they snatched it away from me. They proved to me that my reasoning was nothing but a phase in the dialectic, close quote. Her intellectual agency reduced to a phase or a stage in the universal apparatus of history. Here, history is capital H history, Hegel's history. And her lived experience, thus inscribed as knowable within European episteme, the colonized seeking her lost pasts is an unknowing victim of what Gayatri Spivak dubs the terrorism of reason, dialectic, and the categorical imperative. Without a past and a future, and alienated from her visceral experiences of living as a black body, the colonized is left to occupy, and I quote from Fanon, the crossroads between nothingness and infinity, close quote. The colonized can either remain trapped in the fantasies of becoming white and or in the fantasy of reclaiming a lost black past. Or the colonized can acknowledge her existence as pure negativity. The colonized is a specter wandering between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born. And with nowhere to rest, she is a forlorn figure, an impossible figure of non-being. It is critical that we not make the mistake of reading this negativity as descriptive of the colonized's depreciative position in society. Negativity, in this case, is not tied to a master signifier organizing social relations to the logic of plenitude versus insufficiency. Rather, this negativity is outside any logic underwriting the socio-symbolic, especially the logic of identity and desire. The colonized, Fanon reminds us, and I quote, does not hold itself out as lack or as lacking, but instead it is the lack. Existing between a Black identity as nothing, reduced both in value and as intellectual discourse, and the inaccessible futurity of whiteness, which always remains elusive, the colonized, in the words of David Marriott, is a non-negated negativity. I want to make here a quick distinction between Black as identity and Blackness, as I'm deriving it from Fanon. While Black as identity is established by its difference from another identity, that is white, or in the words of Fanon, not only must the Black man be Black, but he must be Black in relation to the white man. Blackness, as Fanon conceives it, is not reducible to an identity. It is irreverent to symbolic inscription. Blackness, as David Marriott notes, is essentially constituted as the no thing that is not. This n'est pas is the mark of a negativity that cannot be phenomenologized as the work of negation in the sense in which Hegel reads it. Put differently, while Black as identity can be symbolized in terms of self-consolidating alterity, the Black is everything that the white colonizer is not, Blackness, impossible to symbolize, poses the problem of the ontophenomenological. Confronted with Blackness, the colonizer asks, but has no answer to the question, what is this? In the longer version of the project, I argue for understanding the zone of non-being and Blackness as analogous concepts, insofar through the first, Fanon illustrates the real condition of the colonized existence as radical negativity, and through the second, establishes the need for the colonized to embrace or become this negativity for gaining political and subjective freedom from the colonial regime. For only a realization of being this negativity and building a political project in recognition of this negativity truly frees the colonized from desires of legitimacy and puts her on a path towards a politics that does not seek to ignore or override the antagonism, but instead posits it as the real issue for the political. To readers accustomed to the idea of politics as the eradication of social antagonism and its replacement with equitable relations between all members of society, irrespective of class, gender, race, caste, disability, sexuality, etc., this might appear as a rich theoretical premise, but nothing more. And there are different ways of obviously eradicating this issue of difference. One group would say, this eradication has to happen because there is one supreme group. The other group would say that more neoliberal argument that you have to remain together out of tolerant pluralism. But what Fanon is saying is we must understand this difference, this negativity as the unimpeachable core of the social and start thinking about a politics around it. There's a connection, obviously, between this negativity as conceived in Black Skin, White Mask and Fanon's later writings, as in The Wretched of the Earth, where he calls for violence for dismantling the colonial regime. But that has to be a subject for another talk, and I'll get to it another time. So for now, I'd like to conclude here, and I'm more than happy to answer questions and doubts and queries during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, very interesting, stimulating paper that has so much to say actually to the entire Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think it's very interesting how you bring theory together with actual political activities right now. We don't have too much time, but I think if there's anyone who has a question, I would have one question, but let's see in the chat room. Let me read this to you. In the preface of The Wretched of the Earth, Sartre writes, quote, Yellow and black voices still spoke of our humanism, but only to reproach us with our inhumanity, unquote. It is in this light, how much do you consider Fanon and Sartre to be a post-humanists? That's a question. How you can see it in the chat yourself.
Yes, I just saw it. I think that's an excellent question. The first thing to be kept in mind is when I was talking about Fanon's critique of the hijacking of the negritude movement, that's basically a direct critique of Sartre. There's a lot of tensions in Black Skin, White Mask, and one of the tensions that exist has to do with Fanon's, as I said, reliance on Sartre and existential humanism, but also his problem with existential humanism. That's not the only person with whom Fanon has a problem. Fanon has a problem with Hegel as well. Fanon has a problem with Lacan as well, whom he uses in Black Skin, White Mask. But to answer your question in brief, I think I don't want to get into whether Sartre is a post-humanist or something like that, because I am not at the moment working on Sartre. But in my opinion, I think I would like to think of Fanon more as an anti-philosopher. Ella Badu has written recently about the anti-philosophy movement, and I kind of tried to subtly reference that in my paper when I said that there's a problem in the correspondence between truth and knowledge. Philosophy, Badu claims, is always attempting to establish a correspondence between truth and knowledge. There's a truth that can be established on basis of knowledge, and there is a knowledge about truth that is possible. The anti-philosophical movement, or the anti-philosophists, and Badu says this is a tradition that begins with Nietzsche, and then he talks about Lacan, and as a Lacanian, I am also drawing from that tradition. What the anti-philosopher does is that they kind of disrupt this correspondence between truth and knowledge by announcing or drawing attention to a third term that always exists, and in the Lacanian sense, that is the real. Or in context of Fanon, that is the zone of non-being, the negativity that is constitutive of the social space. Once that comes in, this kind of a correspondence between truth and knowledge, or the whole discourse of philosophy as something with which to make sense or attempt to make sense, get much more muddied. So I would, in my opinion, as I am reading Fanon, I'm reading him more as an anti-philosopher in the tradition that is present in Lacan, and that is obviously present back in Nietzsche.
I don't see any other questions, so allow me very quickly to ask, while you were presenting the viewpoints by Fanon, I was thinking immediately of the famous novel, The Invisible Man, I think Alice or something like that. Of course, the one is a novel, the other one is a philosophical approach, but ultimately it's the shared experience of the Black man and the colonized. Do you see closer connection, or do they still address each other? Or I'm not quite sure whether the novel is present to you right now or not.
Because I'm not an Americanist, I try to avoid stepping on other shoes. And Robert and Professor Klassen, you know how our silos are in the US system. However, I would definitely address, short answer, yes, there are. A brilliant reading can happen. But I would like to respond to you by going back to something you mentioned earlier about the connections to the current BLM movement that we are having. And in fact, I'm just about finishing up a Lacanian reading of the BLM movement. And one of the things we see in the BLM movement is, or generally in how US society looks at Black bodies, is as a potential for labor. And unless the body is negated, that labor cannot be realized or accomplished. And anytime the Black body is outside the imaginary of labor, it always, excuse me, it always comes across as excess, as enjoying excessively or as protesting excessively. And therefore, the need to fold this excessive body back under law requires not just one bullet shot, but 10 bullet shots at a 14-year-old. Otherwise, Black bodies are invisible. And this is to draw attention to this negation that the gestures in the protests, whether it's Colin Kaepernick doing a sit down, is about the cutting of the horizontal into a smaller space. It's always the negations: I cannot breathe, or I am not standing tall, I am sitting down. And that goes to other forms of Black expression. If it's not co-opted into the mainstream, it is always radical and excessive. Black literature is radical. Black clothing is distasteful to mainstream taste. Black music is excessive, full of explicit lyrics and sexual innuendos and all that stuff. Remember that case where this 14-year-old and his friends were sitting in a strip mall parking lot, and one man objected to them playing music and shot them dead because he was like, oh my God, what are they playing this gang music for? So I think there is a direct connection, and that's why Fanon is still relevant today. And that's why when we are rereading Fanon, we have to consider how Fanon, by moving into the ontological, by connected ontology to the social, allows us to think or rethink about both the colonial social relations and the way these social relations have translated into the global present.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So I just wrote in the chat that we're running out of time, so that they might be able to address you later via email.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to give my email over there.
That would be wonderful. Great. Thank you so much. So then we transition over, and and I will send you an email as well right away. So our next speaker then, so thank you very much once again. Our next speaker is Professor Robert Masterson from CUNY in New York. It's the borough of Manhattan Community College. And he is working primarily, I think, on creative writing, and has published, for example, Trials of Trial by Water, Artificial Rats and Electric Cats, and Garnished Trouble. He will talk today about Postcolonialism Eats Itself Alive: The Road from Mass Consumption to Self-Consumption in the New Dark Age. Robert, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. As Professor Claassen said, I'm not a literary critic. I'm a creative writer. So this might be somewhat off the general path, but here we go. Autophagy is the cellular process through which the cells within the body consume themselves. In a healthy, nutritionally satisfied body, autophagy is a necessary and beneficial process, sweeping away dead cells, dying cells, and cell debris, utilizing them to nourish and replenish the body's store of healthy cells. I'm sorry, I lost my place. I'm trying to start my timer. However, during periods when proper nutrition from outside sources is unavailable, autophagy becomes a last-ditch effort in the body's efforts to survive. Quite literally, the body begins to eat healthy cells to eat itself. So here we are now, somehow electronically linked together over the worldwide internet system to meet as if in person to discuss the issue at hand, post-colonialism. 20 years into the 21st century, we are poised on the edges of multiple razors, each keen enough to kill through even the slightest misstep. Culturally, politically, socially, spiritually, morally, economically, ecologically, artistically, publicly, and privately, culture is poised and trembling, seeking the path to take safely down this mountain of blades. What the culture has is fast disappearing. What will come seems likely to be dreadful. The forces that shape destiny seem out of control, and culture grasps for even the illusion of self-determination. But where does it go when the road dead ends? Nowhere. What can be eaten when the bowls are empty? Itself. The 21st century can, in many ways, be characterized by its dearth of creativity. This is the age of the reboot, the rewrite, the reinterpretation, and the rerun. Society looks not to a future of innovation and invention, but to a past of romanticized and nostalgic reverie. Empires depend upon their colonies for unregulated streams of resources. The plunder from colonies, the raw materials stripped from colonial territories, produce the material and opportunity for innovation and invention. The riches of India and other British colonies enabled the English to turn their small island into an international power and a center for scientific, medical, artistic, and cultural advancement. The United States of America, the first colony to break away from the British Empire, itself developed a network of influence and domination that functioned in an identical fashion. I would take this opportunity to examine two areas of art that characterize the autophagy of our time, the self-consumption that characterizes the end of empire. Painting and popular music are especially suited for this purpose, as each in its own way depends upon inventiveness and originality to claim the currency of attention used to measure success or failure. Paintings which catch the public eye and meet with public approval, sale, and reproduction are deemed successful. Songs which capture the public ear receive the mass media distribution and sales which define a hit. While we might imagine that it is originality and innovation which leads to such success, even a cursory examination of both painting and music show quite the opposite. It is the familiar, the repetitive, and the easily recognizable which satisfies culture's need for nutrition while masking the autophagy actually taking place. It was thought that the brain was largely resistant to autophagy under these conditions, or at least one part of the brain apparently now appears to self-cannibalize. It's from Smithsonian. First, let's take a look at creativity as a measurable quantity. In 1958, psychologist E. Paul Torrance directed a series of individual tasks within a 90-minute time span to around 400 children in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And these tasks were designed to assess those children's ability to think creatively, to produce something original and useful. The test asked the children to suggest improvements to toys which would make them better and more fun to play with. Torrance was looking for divergent thinking, generating many unique ideas, and then convergent thinking, combining those ideas into the best result. In the decades following the administration of that first series of tests, Torrance and his colleague, Garnett Miller, have tracked the subsequent evidence of creativity among the tested children as they grew into adults, recording every patent earned, every business founded, every research paper published, and every grant awarded. They tallied the books, dances, radio shows, art exhibitions, software programs, advertising campaigns, hardware innovations, music compositions, public policies, whether written or implemented, leadership positions, invited lectures, and buildings designed by these now adult children. Not too terribly surprising, Torrance's test results predicted those children's creative accomplishments as adults. The children who came up with good ideas to improve their toys have grown up to become successful adults in a wide range of fields in which creativity and innovation are rewarded. They became artists, authors, inventors, doctors, diplomats, and business leaders. Their ability to bring something useful and original to their chosen fields, an obvious asset to their personal success. And in the subsequent decades, as almost 300,000 children took the Torrance test, a pattern emerged. Their scores, similar to the standard IQ scores used to measure overall intelligence, had been rising steadily. It seemed to validate the idea that people were getting more creative and smarter. This trend continued until 1990. In 1910, researcher Kyung-hee Kim, working at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, analyzed the cumulative data of the Torrance test results to discover that for the previous decade and for the first time in history, scores began to fall. Those scores continue to fall with each passing year. The question then becomes not only what happens to the individuals who are less creative and less productive than their predecessors, but what happens to a culture as creativity and innovation are in steady decline. And perhaps more importantly, to what may that decline be attributed? It has been established that empire draws sustenance from its colonies or satellite states. That is the very real purpose of a colony. Wealth and resources are drawn from the colony to feed and enrich empire. However, in the last half of the 20th century, empires were recalculated and colonies became independent countries. While the flow of raw materials continued, that flow was no longer unabated, no longer of unregulated benefit to empire. And as in the body, autophagy began. The American artist Andy Warhol delivered the most succinct, concise address of artistic autophagy in 1962. His now iconic Campbell's soup can, no, I can't get it. I'm sorry. I was going to share the photo, but I can't. But I'm sure you're familiar with Andy Warhol's multiple image of a Campbell's soup can right off the supermarket shelf. It was a direct address of the state of painting in the post-colonial world. This silkscreen print in all its variations was a direct address of the dearth of creativity and innovation in contemporary society and the overall move towards self-consumption, toward autophagy on increasing display throughout our culture. These mass-produced prints were both insightful and controversial, confronting as they did the culture's decreasing ability to supplant itself with the wealth derived from colonization. Without the raw materials and resources supplied by colonial exploitation, even the world of painting was forced to become self-consuming. And it is not a particularly remarkable jump from Warhol's mechanical reproduction of factory-produced commodities to the paintings produced by artificial intelligence now insinuating itself into the art world. Computers, devoid of emotion, attachment, and self-criticism, manipulate robotic painting devices to produce a simulation of human creativity to fill the vacuum. And I would dearly love to share this with you if I can possibly do it. And I apparently—
What you can do is you would have to, yeah, oh, that works.
Can you see the painting?
Yes.
Okay, so that's created by a machine. It's really of nothing. So anyway, back to what I'm saying. Appers, this is the title of the painting, is held and sold by Art AI. And it's just it is just one of a gallery full of images created without creativity. Produced by a computer program, Apers is a logical extension of Warhol's soup cans. It is a machine-generated mimicry, a machine aping the outcome of human inventiveness without using creativity at all. Presented and sold as fine art, such work defines autophagy in action in a culture increasingly starved of the intellectual and practical resources previously provided by colonialism. Such art can be seen intruding into almost every level of visual expression. The film industry has become dependent upon computer-generated imagery, CGI, not only for expensive, impractical, or impossible special effects, but for an overall smoothing or enhancement of the most prosaic scenes. With mind-numbing frequency, the images we see in entertainment, advertising, and art are not in any way sense real. They are fabrications substituting for authentic, imaginative depiction, and they have clouded our ability to perceive reality itself. Our expectations of both reality and artistic representation are wholly clouded by the result of this lack of creativity and substitution of artifice for authenticity. And the more our vision is saturated by these ersatz images, the more we reject the real to consume illusion. It is a vicious cycle fueled by culture's increasing appetite for itself. We are literally eating ourselves, the apex of autophagy. Even more than painting, though, pop music is an almost constant presence in our common experience. Pop music blares from a multitude of sources, from radios and televisions and telephones and iPods and iPads, from passing cars and other rooms, from restaurants and markets and elevators and the agora itself. And this cacophony is the modern soundtrack to life. Pop music is a $43.5 billion a year industry dedicated to generating income from the dissemination of commodified creativity. And there's a quote here. Songwriting today is not the romantic notion of one kid with a guitar. It's an impersonal and assembly line driven process that would have made Henry Ford proud. The process of creating hit songs for this popular music market has been streamlined into an assembly line process that serves nothing and no one so much as itself, a mirror reflecting a mirror to both shape and satisfy consumers' taste. When a music factory team is in place and working, beats, hooks, and tracks are manufactured, traded, overlapped, and combined to construct up to 12 songs a day. Presented to the vocal artist, songs are manipulated, altered, accepted, and rejected to suit the market needs of the corporation investing in their fabrication. Lyrics are contrived and fed to singers whose voices are recorded and improved with synthetic devices such as autotune, a device widely used in the studio and at concerts to make artists sound pitch perfect. The music itself is comprised of computer-enhanced performances by human musicians or completely synthesized by innumerable computing devices. As a colleague of mine at school is perhaps overly fond of declaring, creativity is irrelevant and instead it's all about the mashup. In this context, a mashup is a creative work, usually in the form of a song, created by blending two or more pre-recorded songs, usually by superimposing the vocal track of one song seamlessly over the instrumental track of another, increasing the tempo and pitch while adding or reducing gaps to make it flow. One of the most common examples of mashup is the musical sample, a process in which a musical phrase is removed from its original context and inserted into another song, usually as a repeated element. Before his death, the American godfather of soul, James Brown, found himself to be the most sampled artist of all time, a use of his creative talents for which he received no payment. It was only after lengthy and expensive legal contests was he awarded ownership of his own music and the right to compensation. The mashups constructed out of the shards of his music had to be extracted, identified, and counted before his creative genius could even be recognized. Either unrestricted or even bound by copyright law, popular music has, again, literally consumed itself. No matter the genre, hip hop, R&B, rock, country western, K-pop, J-pop, that idealized vision of an artist and an instrument venturing together in a creative process to make real a measured sequence of sounds heretofore unheard has been systematically erased and replaced by a bank of electronic devices, endlessly snipping and stitching the bits and pieces of existing music into supposedly new forms that in reality are merely iterations of existing songs. Pop music is no longer the province of the new, challenging, and intriguing, but instead it's just a mashup of a mashup of a mashup. Now, I don't want to harp upon the way things were always better in the past. But it is more than relevant to know that it is what is almost universally considered to be the best pop album in music history. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was indeed the product of four young men's imaginative use of words and instruments to create songs the audience had never heard before, that their audience had never heard anything similar before. They couldn't even dance to it. Even those songs on the album that utilized studio manipulation of audio recordings did so in an often imitated, never equaled, and utterly groundbreaking fashion. George Martin, the Beatles' late producer, said this: "When I first started in the music business, the ultimate aim for everybody was to try and recreate on record a live performance as accurately as possible. Without being too pompous, we decided to go in another kind of art form. where we are devising something that couldn't be done any other way. We were putting something down on tape that could only be done on tape. Starved of influences, inspirations, and materials acquired through colonialism, Western culture is already deep in the process of autophagy. From Cubism's roots in African imagery to popular music's absorption of worldwide musical styles, types, and instrumentation, culture has, in the fact, been able to reflect genuine creativity and innovation. In this post-colonial world, however, art in all its forms has become increasingly meta. Art about art, music about music. This disastrous autophagy is chilling in its implications, not the least of which is the death of the body. And that's it. I'm done.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, great and sad at the same time. I mean, almost
Yes.
depressing, but I feel that we would have to agree with you. But anyway, are there any questions? Well,
I rushed through that. I am sorry, I spoke very fast.
no, that's okay. But Robert, maybe we can pick up something what we both discussed before everything started. I mentioned to you that I had written a paper on the relevance of poetry today. And I had mentioned the situation in Dubai, where actually medieval Arabic poetry has become the most popular performance on TV, outbeating actually World Championship soccer games. So kind of strange, as if maybe what we are facing right now is the death of the postmodern culture, and maybe you're just waiting for the renovation or the Renaissance, maybe as in the past. You know, Western culture has often, and maybe Eastern culture too, I don't know, but has often recovered itself by going back to its roots and then starting fresh and maybe recovering the future.
I would totally agree with that. And I find it astoundingly heartening that a culture so technologically advanced as that in Dubai, or living in this sort of modernistic palace, has rejected the computerized, overdubbed, overly sampled, artificial music that's considered contemporary, and instead turned back to poetry of all things as enriching and nourishing, and it goes beyond entertainment, as an enriching and nourishing component of people's lives, in the way that poetry was originally intended to be.
Robert, would you then talk about identity? That
Okay,
loss of identity?
Well, I think both of these trends in painting and in popular music are seeking to erase identity.
Because I'm thinking very much of Benjamin's theory about mimesis. Modern art, I think already in the 1920s, he warned us about the danger that all art has become mimesis, just replication, reproducibility, no creativity. Right.
Exactly. And by doing so, you're taking away the individual characteristics of the work itself and of the creator. When they're, and suddenly we find ourselves in this situation in the modern world where there is no creator.
Yeah.
The work seems to spring full blown from a bank of computers, either musically or visually. Who is responsible for this? And we sort of shrug our heads and point to the back room full of servers. Say, hey, it came out of that place. No one is, who did it? Who, with all of their faults and all of their flaws, and God knows artists, believe me, I know this. Artists have so many of their faults and flaws. The current trend erases that, just in the way that computer enhancement erases the features of a human face to smooth it out, to make it pleasing, to to somehow standardize it so that the actresses and the actors, the models, the people that we see in advertising, on television, and motion pictures begin to have the same kind of look, almost like that plastic surgery look that women of a certain age begin to get when their face is pulled back and everyone just has the appearance of sort of a skull, and every skull looks the same.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely erasing the individual.
Right. So here's a question. Let me read it back to you. If we consider mass culture to be the culture of the masses versus pop culture as culture that is manufactured to appeal to the masses, would you say that mass culture has to find its representation and fight for a place in pop culture?
I would say that I would wonder. Yes. I see what you're saying. And mass culture is distinct from popular culture because it is not commodified. Mass culture is an organic outgrowth of whatever it is that people create for them, by themselves, for themselves. And yet I find, at least in the United States, that the time between the creation of something truly unique, something brand new, whether it's a hairstyle or a way to wear or clothing or slang, is immediately snatched up in electronic speed and devoured, literally devoured, consumed, and reprocessed and refabricated beyond all recognition. So that once, where mass culture once produced things that were, let's just say, cool, hip, whatever, slang words, that process is now so self-reflecting that there is no such thing anymore. So yes, mass culture needs to divorce itself from popular culture, if such a thing is possible, to separate itself from popular commodified culture in order to retain any degree of authenticity, creativity, innovation, believability. Yeah.
So I see a question there. How is the post-colonialism context central to the point being made here?
Well, I see what I see, and I think the research that, for instance, Torrance was, when I was talking about with the Torrance test, with the creativity test, is that following World War II, when empire was truly redistributed, when the vast empires of let's say the British Empire, the largest empire of the modern world, was just shattered. Empire, the United States, Britain, a few other places, lost that steady stream of outside influence. We not only did we lose the raw materials, but we lost the capacity for innovation from outside sources. Cubism was born from Picasso's fascination with African art. Well, those, as an example, and as those things have been cut off because of the restrictions of independence, no longer was the colonial able to just walk in and take, but there had to be some kind of negotiation and cost and whatnot. Well, the colonial powers just said, no. We lost that kind of influence, and no choice then, in order to feed the industry based on these things, the painting, the music, whatever, fashion, whatever, it begins to turn inward and begins to look increasingly to itself as a resource. And you can only do that so long before that process, which biologically is called autophagy, begins to do serious damage to the body as a whole.
So here's an interesting question, maybe the last one. Then the question pertains to how can we solve internal colonization? And I think that's a very nice way of putting it. So you're talking really about internal colonization, right?
Right.
Quite a useful phrase. Thank you. That is from a question here in the chat room.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I see that. And I see it now. You know, I wish I knew. It's how do you feed a starving person? You have to find food. And if you can't find it in the normal places, you have to find it someplace else. So I don't know. The systems that we have were created and depend upon colonialism. So it's going to take a major rethinking of economics, of politics, of diplomacy in order to rearrange the world into a nourishing place in which not only natural resources, which are running out, but valid thoughts and valid ideas and valid perspectives can be exchanged on an equitable basis without starving one or the other of the participants. So I don't really know, you know. All I know is it's going to take something very radical. And I fear it's going to only, that's why I sort of titled this, you know, all of this taking place in a new dark age, because I have what I'm seeing is certainly in the United States is a reluctance to retool, a reluctance to admit ultimately that systems are failing, but instead propping them up with dreams and wishes, with the nostalgia for a past that's completely false and fabricated. You know, revolution, really, on all sorts of levels. Revolution from the personal to the public, economics, artistic, everything is going to have to be revolutionized because we are literally dying.
Allow me just to throw out two more words, and then we need to end right here. But in light of what you were saying, I think the two key things that we are losing are silence and slowness.
Very good. I would agree. There's no room for those.
No. And that's exactly the pre-modern that could lead over to the postmodern. Silence and slowness.
Both of which have become enormously expensive.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and you particularly, Robert. And well, we just switch over to the next talk. Would the organizers want to say something?
Yes, thank you very much on behalf of the organizing committee. Thank you, Dr. Albert Klessen, to chairing the session. And thanks to Dr. Gautam Basu Thakur and Dr. Robert Masterson for their wonderful lecture. And I hope that this sort of lecture will explore many more ideas, and our young researchers will get a lot of help. So thank you very much once again, and we'll move on to the next section, next part of the program. I hope Tanmoy is with us, and Tanmoy will declare what is the next part of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, should we just dive into it?
Hi, am I audible? Hello. Yeah, those were indeed really interesting sessions. And I'll just take a few minutes here, and then we can go right into the next session. And maybe Professors Masterson and Klassen can continue on the very interesting conversation you were already having here. To all who just come in, good afternoon again. On behalf of the organizing committee of the 3-day international e-conference on rethinking the post-colonial, organized by New Literaria Journal in collaboration with Assam University. I especially welcome you to this special seminar session. Without further ado, I'll introduce our chairperson, who just delivered such a rich and interesting talk himself, Robert Matheson, Professor of English at Borough of Manhattan Community College, USA. As you've heard, he's not just an academic, he's a really well thought out literary writer himself. And, you know, his influences range from Richard Brautigan and H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Bobby Louis Hawkins, Frank O'Hara, Jane Ann Phillips, Yukio Mishima, Patti Smith, Jack Kerouac, and it's like all over the map of America and the world. And as he likes to say himself, he's beat, but he's not yet broken. Over to you, sir.
All right, thank you. It is my true honor, actually. Very pleased to introduce someone who I think was a new friend, Dr. Albrecht Clausen, who is a distinguished university professor at in the Department of German Studies at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Clausen has studied at a number of universities in the United States, in Germany, in Great Britain, in Spain, in Italy. His broad range of research topics covers the entire history of the history of medieval and early modern German and European literature. He has published close to 90 scholarly books, critical editions, translation and textbooks, and 9 poetry volumes of his own. So he's quite the Renaissance man, even though he's a medievalist. And he's received, I think, an award that certainly I'm interested in knowing more about. But the German government awarded him the Order of Merit. Seems to me like it's akin to a knighthood. But let us now turn our attention to Professor Clausen, and who will be speaking with us today on literature as a tool of epistemology, medieval perspectives for post-modernity. Professor Clausen.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the very kind introduction. And thank you once again to the organizers. I would like to salute you, first of all, because you have done something which is really the important and necessary thing we need for our present. We are really now in a global world, and you have provided us with a wonderful platform where we can finally meet, and we therefore defy the crisis. We have overcome thereby intellectually COVID-19. And I think that is really a wonderful thing. So thank you all very much for this great opportunity. I want to present something else. Namely, I don't have a paper written. Well, I do have a paper written, but I have abstracted from that paper a PowerPoint presentation. And I only need to know right now whether you all can see this. Maybe Robert, can you confirm that you see this? Can you see? It says literature.
Yes, we can see it, but we also see, yeah, there we go. That's the best, right there.
Very good. Okay. So I'm coming from a little bit different perspective, but I think there are some very interesting segues between the last talk and my own. I call my talk Literature as a Tool of Epistemology, but I use now, strangely maybe, but I think quite meaningfully, medieval perspectives for post-modernity. And I want to see how these two worlds or these chronological periods can, should, might, and will talk to each other. Just first of all, some very general comments. I want to build bridges between the pre-modern and postmodern issues, and want to see, first of all, how we even understand the material we all are dealing with. For whom is literature written? I mean, these are very general questions. Is, however, literature written only for the current readership? What are people reading? We heard a lot in the last talk about the Beatles. I myself mentioned Walter Benjamin, and we have heard of various other writers already. So I think literature as such, as I want to understand it, it is not something only written now for the current readership, but literature is a much more vibrant and much richer phenomenon. It is not simply something for adults or only for youth or only for children. Some of the best children's literature I know have been really tremendously influential for adults. Youth literature can be very tremendously important for adults or for children. So literature is really something open for everyone. and we can never really sort of specify literature as only for women or only for men or only for transgender people or whatever it might be. Literature is really a universal phenomenon. It addresses all people. It provides them all with a voice, a medium. And so I would like to say the human word in its poetic expression serves really a universal purpose. And what I'm probing here is, particularly in the world of postmodernity, where is the human and how can the human dimension be preserved through critical reading, also sensitive and poetic reading of literature in a larger context, or maybe philosophical texts. And my purpose here is, because I'm a medievalist, I want, however, to try to situate the medieval in the present and the post-modern modern world. And I have chosen just a few examples to illustrate my strategies. And my premise for this talk is that I'm exploring what is the essence of literature in itself. We need to keep that in mind. And I would like to argue very strongly, really, that good literature can be defined, or good art, or good movies, or good video games, whatever it might be, if those products are the results of human creativity. And I mean, we heard that just before from Robert, but also to what extent those products or creations allow us to find universals. Human life is determined by universals such as virtues, by vices, and by really fundamental concepts, good versus evil. You can look all over the world and you always find some of these basic constructs without which neither pre-modern, modern, or postmodern would even work. These are the fundamental issues that all people need. More specifically, there is always the drive for God, the drive for spirituality, or the search for spirituality. There's always the question, what constitutes good? What constitutes evil? Who are we as individuals? And that is wonderfully captured by the universal phrase, the happiness. Not just a temporary material form of happiness, but what is a deeply rooted form of happiness. By the same token, we always search for the ineffable, the unspeakable, the other dimension. That's what literature does, and thereby providing us somehow with the answer for the question, what is actually the meaning of our existence? These issues, such as death or love or courage and other things, are fundamental in all of human life, medieval or modern. I would like, of course, to argue that to some extent, these fundamentals and universals have been more clearly expressed by writers in the medieval period, maybe because they were less encumbered by the cacophony we are living in. So I would like to present the so-called 7 C's with which I am working whenever I approach any literary text, postmodern, modern, or medieval. Namely, I begin with communication. Communication is the crucial tool that makes all life even possible. Secondly, we live in a community. We are able to exist only if we have a commitment to that community. We must always look for compromise, otherwise we end up in war. And we need to coordinate and cooperate and ultimately have then a form of companionship. If you will, then you can also add courage and other points. But for me, this is sort of the framework of all human existence throughout times, and we find these 7 or 8 C's beautifully expressed in literary text, poetry, plays, and so forth. I would like to illustrate this with 3 or 4 examples. I go through those fairly quickly so that I have a little bit time to reflect on those special issues. I begin with Apollonius of Tyre, which was a Greek text written probably in the 2nd, maybe the 3rd century, which ultimately addresses these universal issue of fortune versus misfortune. And we all know that human life is always in an up and down. The question there in this romance or novel, which was then translated in many, many languages throughout the centuries, well into the 17th century, is the question, how do we find virtues and how do virtues play out in our human existence? Or by the same token, character and ethics. All human life is determined by ethics. And if we abandon this quest for ethics, we are losing the pilot light in our existence. And the most central metaphor or icon in this work is the shipwreck, the individual, the protagonist who goes through life and suddenly experiences the absolute shipwreck. This is now maybe a medieval or late antique image, but at the same time, you need just to think about aircraft crashing, car accident, or medical problem. It is the metaphor of the shipwreck. And what do we do when our life suddenly goes through a shipwreck? How do we get out of this? And how do we survive and find our own life? We have here the experience of pirates. We have the phenomenon of prostitution, so sexual violence or commodification. And ultimately, the most important thing is this work is determined by riddles. And a riddle, we all know what riddles are, but I translate riddles as a medium, a poetic, a literary, philosophical medium to explore human epistemology. So this entire work is determined by riddles, and only those who can solve riddles are ultimately able to find the meaning of life. I've just one image here from a manuscript. Here's another image. So people in the pre-modern world were deeply concerned with the whole notion of how do we handle shipwrecks and how do we survive such a catastrophic situation. Anyone who works in an emergency center or hospital knows that shipwrecks happen all the time. And this is what really determines much of our contemporary life, as much as we're trying to handle this with modern medicine or insurance and whatsoever. But this universal experience comes through in that text. Now, all we need to do is to translate it into modern terms, and suddenly we're at the core of the philosophical message. And so what this text really addresses is or are the vagaries of all human existence, or maybe expressed in the form of the wheel of fortune. I will come back to that a little bit later. Or the sea voyage, meaning that life, our human life, is not stable, and we always have to reckon with danger, catastrophes. Of course, there are also safe harbors, but the whole idea of this transfer or crossing off the ocean is the most important metaphor that resonated throughout the entire Middle Ages and well into our modern time, and maybe allows us to find a tool to cut through the maze in which we find ourselves in the postmodern world, because we no longer really seem to know what happiness or sorrow are, or how we can balance those two components together. So there's always gain and loss, there's love and death, and there is life determined by a riddle, which I would say is really almost a very good postmodern icon, because it forces the individual to approach or to embark on a quest for epistemological understanding of human life. Another text which I find extremely important in this context is 12th century, late 12th century Anglo-Norman poet Marie de France, who wrote wonderful short verse narratives and also fables in which she addresses universal global issues such as love, happiness, marriage, and she embeds all those issues in many of these C words, addressing communication, compassion, community, coordination, and so forth. And what I observe and would like to present is that some of these pre-modern writers already, or maybe well ahead of our own times, were able to identify, isolate, and address then universal concerns and needs. And what I find in all my daily teaching situation, also my research when I write, is that these medieval poets were already able to address many of the same concerns we have. Maybe even we are much more troubled today because we live in such a complex and ever-shifting universe, whereas the pre-modern world was maybe a little bit more simpler, maybe, but could thereby address some of the fundamental issues already at that time in a much more visible way. Here just the manuscript, how she might have looked like, but that is not so important. But let me also try to show you to what extent the discourse developed by this medieval writer might actually address postmodern concerns, because she also wrote fables. You all know what fables are. There are a lot of Indian fables, there are Arabic fables, Chinese fables, Brazilian fables, French, German, American fables, and fables animals talk. And in Marie's fables, many times you have questions about problems in human life, such as violence, bad leaders, lack of freedom, quest for intelligent handling of our existence, such as in this wonderful fable, which really is out of the sort of the textbook for postmodern questions about freedom and justice, namely the lamb and the wolf. Wolf is upstream, lamb is downstream. Wolf wants to eat the lamb, blames the lamb for having soiled the fresh water. Lamb defends itself. Wolf says, you are really impetuous. Lamb says, I'm downstream, I'm innocent. And the wolf then devours the lamb at any rate. And so Marie de France addresses here this universal issue that the powerful and rich are abusing the poor and downtrodden. Almost a voice from the past for our own efforts to steer or navigate through a world where politics make our lives ever more complicated. So these are the things that I talked about. And basically, she talks about legalized killing by the powerful. And as a medieval aristocratic poet, she raises her voice in order to defend the poor. Just very quickly, because I'm much running out of time, another major writer, Swiss-German writer, a Dominican priest, who wrote a marvelous collection called The Gemstone about 1350, where he has 100 fables and addresses many different issues. And I only want us to discuss very briefly one, maybe to convince you to take a look at this text. I just translated all these texts into English, and one of the last fables deals with a story. It's not really a fable, but of a king and a wise man. The wise man goes out on the market and he sells wisdom. And the king wants to buy some wisdom, so he sends out his servants. They buy wisdom, whatever that might mean. And the wise man writes down on a sheet of paper, keep the end of your life always in mind. So the king pays a high amount for this odd sentence. He has it inscribed over his entrance door. When soon enough an assassination attempt is planned, and the man who's supposed to kill the king reads the inscription, begins to realize that it kind of addresses him. He trembles, pales, and he's apprehended, reveals his plans to assassinate the king, and the king's life is thereby spared. So the message there is, keep the end of your life in mind, and you will be well prepared to have a good life and to be ready for death. And what I always tell my students is always, or I raise the question, what is the best time in your life to think about death? And the answer simply is now. Whenever you start even thinking, now, not later, not just before you are then in the hospital bed, but now, when you're young, fresh, strong, and you struggle, now. And death makes your life rich. Death gives you meaning. And only when you face and accept and embrace death will you suddenly understand the true wisdom of life. So that is sort of quick summary, and I move on. There are many, many more possibilities to think about that, and we could also here talk about freedom. This is a major writer defending freedom, and I wished I had Bonaris with me to fight for in the American elections for a new president. He really would have something to say for us, but let's move on. At least I want to argue the postmodern struggle to find freedom, to preserve our freedom, to defend our freedom finds already its antecedents in the pre-modern world. And very, very briefly, the greatest writer of them all, the one philosopher who really speaks to all of us in an absolutely amazing way, who wrote Boethius, who wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, 524. And he wrote this text a few months before he was stoned to death on false, made-up charges of state treason. And so he became the schoolmaster of the entire West, and actually should be the schoolmaster of the entire world, very much today, even in the postmodern world, because he's teaching us that human sense of happiness today or then is normally an illusion, because our happiness depends or is predicated on money, on power, on honor, family, sex, friends, and none of those things are really ours. They're only loaned to us because fortune is constantly changing, and everything we have in our life is only on loan. Hence, we cannot predicate our sense of happiness on the material conditions of our lives. We need to look for something which is beyond, and this is the other key word, beyond contingency. Our life is troubled. Our postmodern life is so troubled, Boethius would explain to us, because we base our sense of happiness on contingency, on the material, physical form, which is always fleeting. And only once we get through this wheel of fortune and embrace, let's say, misfortune, will we come to truth. And a very tiny little scene is so important. He said, or philosophy, who shows up as an allegorical figure, says something really, really powerful, namely says, only in time of misfortune, when you are suffering, will you find out who your true friends are. Truth comes through only, absolutely only, when you go through misfortune. And so we're moving beyond the wheel of fortune, beyond the world of contingency, into the world of freedom of contingency, which he then calls the good, and where we all strive, because it is the goal to realize our own potential, which might be a very Buddhistic teaching already, although Boethius knew nothing about it. But it is sort of the message from late antiquity for our postmodern world, reminding us to free ourselves of our deception, of our illusions, and to follow, as it says here, the own good, that is us, it is our own instinct, namely the instinct to become ourselves and to realize our potentials, and thereby to join the world of absolute goodness. You might call this God, or you might call it the summum bonum, or the good itself, which needs nothing on the outside, namely is free from contingency. So just to sum up, the medieval and in the postmodern, I know there will be a lot of questions. How can you situate the medieval in the postmodern world? And I would argue and explain thereby that many of these universal messages that were already addressed at that time, they are absolutely extremely relevant in our postmodern world. And in a way, if we step back one step just into the past, we might be able to step forward 2 steps into our future. So the postmodern is, of course, around us. We are here, but the postmodern is sort of the canopy of our trees, whereas our roots are deep in the soil. And without a communication between the canopy and the roots, no tree can grow, no plant. And that's what we really are. There would be countless other examples. I would have loved to talk about this. And I only can say, only when the protagonist or us learns how to gaze into the depth, into the dark, into the inside, into himself or into his own soul, is the individual able to overcome his or his spiritual sickness and his sense of forlornness, his sense of loneliness, and then progress and find himself once again. This would be and also another or many other topics such as in mysticism. I leave this and come up here with my conclusion. And I miss an O, I just see. I propose in strong terms that the pre-modern voices indeed have a significant role to play in our own time, particularly because the postmodern world finds itself in such a turmoil and needs solid foundations in ethics, morality, idealism, spirituality. And I do not, and again, I read this, I do not call for a conservative traditional viewpoint or for a return to the past. Far from it. I don't want to live in the Middle Ages. Oh, no. But I do call for an innovation of our postmodern discourse by means of studying past voices that can speak to us as well. So thank you very much. And here's my contact information, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you all for listening to me, and once again, for allowing me to be part of this conference. Thank you.
Extraordinary. Thank you so much, Professor Claassen. I know I've got some questions, but let me turn to the chat to begin to address some of the questions that have occurred here. But again, thank you for such an extraordinary look into that distant mirror, into those times, which, and maybe the past isn't the past, you know, as William Faulkner says.
Isn't it a circle?
No, absolutely. And it seems clearer and clearer the more and more we study these things. And certainly your talk here has brought so much of that to light. I really appreciate your perspective on this. And so one of our listeners has asked that, has written this: a major challenge in today's world is to move people to take wisdom from older sources. In the present, we have a tendency to reject something even a couple of months old as being outdated and old-fashioned. How do we help people see the depth and value in learning from past experience and observation?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Now, let me tell you something, what I have been doing since actually the COVID-19 crisis broke out, and I started to look around my world. I have a little digital camera, and I started to look at everything I can see. I'm looking and take photos of leaves, of bark, of petals, of rocks, of fish, treetops, and I begin to sharpen my view every day. And since I have started posting these photos on Facebook, suddenly my entire world has changed, because what I have observed myself is that I suddenly begin to realize that every leaf, every dried leaf or whatever, or needle, has a structure, a profile, a character. And so by some gazing, I want to say the gaze, we need to look more. We find an infinite amount, an ocean of beauty everywhere in terms of sound and images, touch. I mean, who has touched a bark lately? Who has smelled a book? Who has just lately touched the hair of a beloved person? When your beloved person dies, what do? The person is in the hospital bed. What do? We touch the hair. And there suddenly the beauty of the person comes back. These are the little moments. And for me, both doing research, medieval texts, as well as being a creative poet as much as I can, or taking photos, allows me, at least in my tiny little existence, to bring creativity back, to bring the past back, and to step forward. I'm a teacher, for heaven's sake. So for me, injecting these medieval perspectives into my modern classroom, where we sometimes also talk about the notion about time. What is time? Time defines us. Space defines us. And so these tools allow us, this slowness, the slowing down allows us to accelerate. It sounds paradox, and just this very paradox gives me hope.
Okay. To somewhat continue what you're talking about, at least certainly at the beginning, when you're talking about going outside and really experiencing in a calm and quiet way the world around us, your environment. Here's another question. When a person deviates from materialism, they're seen as antisocial. How then is it possible for a person to leave materialism and search for the good and actual peace that is surrounding us?
I remember a movie I saw once. It was a movie about the life of Buddha. And I remember how Buddha was fasting, ascetic, and just for years and almost dying, when suddenly he had the enlightenment and he started eating again. Not excessive, but becoming detached and just enjoying what you have without needing much. So I think one of the problems also in the Middle Ages or in modern times is overly passionate or obsessive attaching to things. So when you can drink a glass of wine, then just enjoy it. Whether it costs $5 or $50, just enjoy you have a glass of wine. Or when you have the opportunity to read a great poem, it might be a poem by an unknown person. But if it speaks to you, then it speaks to you. So I think the almost Buddhistic approach, detachment, enjoy what you have. I would really say don't, Boethius says the same thing. Boethius says, no, when you're rich, fine, enjoy it. When you have family, enjoy it. But don't think that gives you the ultimate happiness, because it's not there forever. Right. So don't be obsessive. Don't be, that's what these poets say. Be realistic, be moderate, and thereby you find a new form of happiness. So I think people in the pre-modern world had the advantage, also disadvantage, of being very religious, but thereby they also had the opportunity to see through a different lens. So I think for me, the lens, the scope, the microscope, the telescope, the ability to see through a different lens into your own life to gain deeper spirituality, that is kind of, I think, what postmodern poets, writers, and people in general can and should do. Look again. Maybe that might work.
Let me ask you a question about something that you spoke very early in your presentation. And it's something perhaps that I feel somewhat akin to. You spoke about literature's aspiration toward the universal, to speak to something universal, applicable across the board to all people at all times. Do you find that contemporary or even postmodern literature is not attempting to universality? or is that goal still intact?
I'm optimist. I see a lot of young people who are very dedicated and very inspired writing poetry, for example. I cannot speak in statistical terms. It's hard to say. Well, at the same time, well, I'm a little bit torn because I live in a world where virtually no one amongst my colleagues or so respects poetry, seems like. So when I write poetry, no, professors don't write poetry. Come on, forget it. But then I meet other people who also write poetry, and suddenly there's a very different community. And I know some really younger people who write beautiful poetry, but it doesn't have to be poetry. I would rather want to say the word. So I love writing my research. I love to write essays. I love to write philosophical texts. I love to write letters to the editor or guest opinions in the newspaper. I think just simply the embracing of the word or the sound of music, it doesn't matter what it is, or the just enjoyment of paint or whatever it might be, or the ability to work with things, just to let your own inner self come through. And there are many different ways. And there are people who are fantastic with video games and create really wonderful new things. Of course, there's a very great danger you talked about, the reproducibility. That's a very tempting, very slippery road. And I'm not sure how this all will transpire, but I want to be more optimistic. And I think young people, particularly in our postmodern world, they're trying. And so I also think the book the end of the book hasn't come yet. The books are being produced. It's the obituary for the book is not there yet. That's premature. And so maybe the icon of the book itself might be the key for the future. You might notice, for example, that bookstores seem to experience kind of a comeback. Maybe because people begin to realize there is something that they can hold, tangible, palpable. It has sort of haptic quality. Yeah, okay, and I see this could be romanticizing the past, but I don't think that is romanticizing, but rather it's the question, what matters? And I have a beautiful book by a poet, a book I just picked up somewhere. I don't know this man, Paul Williams, and his title of the book is Remembering Your Essence. And that's the question. Who are we? How do we determine our essence? And if I don't know what my essence is, and frankly, the question here is not so much Middle Ages, it could be a 19th century, it can be 20th century. There are great poets during the 20th, the last 10 years right now. So I rather want to say we have many different voices in or music instruments. It's just like you're looking at an orchestra. If you have only percussions, well, it can be interesting, but you really prefer to have violins and cello and piano and whatever. So these differences of voices. And so if you're just tolerant and curious, I think that's the key thing, that you're curious and tolerant and well, integrate these various different voices, suddenly the postmodern discourse becomes much richer. And I think that is then very fruitful. It's like a cornucopia. I'm looking for a literary cornucopia.
Okay, okay. I think you and I could continue to talk for a couple more hours.
Let me say also, because I see somebody got disconnected, I have written up the entire piece and the article is already in the hands of the editors of the journal. So I hope it will appear in print. Maybe somebody can speak to that. I don't know.
Excellent, excellent.
Good. Robert, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Professor, thank you so much. This has been a very enjoyable early morning for me. I'm so glad I was able to stay up and participate.
I enjoyed the other talks too, yes.
All right.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. And indeed, both of you, I think with the back-to-back sessions and the conversations you've had for both of your talks with each other have been made for very, very interesting food for thought. And I'd like to thank Professor Klassen and Professor Masterson on behalf of the journal and the conference for speaking to us today and taking time out of your busy schedule. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been my honor completely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I think we can move on to our next set of sessions, which will be hosted by one of my co-hosts. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Good night.
Good night, Robert.
Good night.
I would stay on a little bit longer.
Okay, I must go to bed. It's almost 3 o'clock in the morning here.
God. Yeah, it's almost midnight here.
Okay. I feel very energized, though. It's going to take me a while to wind down. So thank you very much, everyone. And I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been extremely rewarding. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Warhol, for passing the mic on to me. We now start our next session. And me as host, I am Ankana. And on behalf of New Literaria, I would like to introduce Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta in this session. Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta began his career in the academia in 1999 and is presently Associate Professor and Head in the Department of English and Cultural Studies, the University of Purdue. He is passionate about Shakespeare and the European Renaissance, and his doctoral thesis, which he received his PhD degree in 2006, was titled "Genre and Making in Shakespeare's Histories." He is member of the Shakespeare Society of India and has earlier also been a member of the British Shakespeare Association. His other interests include 18th century British literature and culture, adaptation studies, and postmodern literature and culture. Besides, Dr. Sengupta is also a lover of poetry, theatre, sports, painting, and photography. With this brief introduction, which in no way does justice to the achievements of Dr. Sengupta, I request Dr. Sengupta to take it on from here. Dr. Sengupta, the platform is all yours now. Thank you.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon to everyone here. We are about to begin a new session, and there are two speakers in this session, Dr. Bhupati and Dr. Abhishek Parui. The first speaker is Dr. P. Bhupati, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of English Studies, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Central University of Tamil Nadu. And we have two exciting papers in this session. The first paper, which is to be presented by Dr. Bhupati, is titled Place, Memory and Identity, Exploring Refugeehood in Transnational Space. And the second paper is by Dr. Abhishek Parui, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, India. And his paper is titled Memory Studies and Post-Colonial Identities. I'll invite now the first speaker to present his paper, Dr. Bhupati. Dr. Bhupati, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Yeah. I mean, I did.
Yes. Good afternoon, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
But before we begin, I'd just like the organizers to let me know how many minutes each speaker gets. Can one of the organizers tell me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I just want to know how many minutes each speaker gets to present a paper. And how have you organized the session? Do you have a session for discussion after the papers are presented, after both the papers are presented? Or do we take questions at the end of each presentation?
So we will have questions at the end of two sessions. After Abhishekda, we will have the questions. We'll take the
All
questions.
right, after Abhishek's paper. And how long does each
So
paper presenter get to
we
speak?
have 20 minutes for presentation, and then we can have a question at the end of second speaker.
All right, so
Thank you,
20 minutes
Dr.
for each speaker, and after both the papers have been read, we have a session for questions. All right, thank you very much. Now let's go ahead with the papers, and I invite Dr. P. Bhupati from the School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Central University of Tamil Nadu, to present his paper.
Thank you very much, Professor Subhajit Chandra. And at the outset, I thank the organizers, Literaria Journal, and the Department of English, Assam Central University, for giving me this opportunity to present my paper. And yes, so good afternoon, everyone. As the title of my paper has already been read by the chair, I would directly get into my presentation. So let me just first tell you the content of my presentation, so how I have arranged the paper. So for first, I would be talking to you about the locating the subject refugee group in a transnational space. Then I would go on talking to you about the idea of place, memory, and identity, which actually constitute the refugee group as a sort of stateless and rootless subject. Then I would also talk to you about how this subject position constructed out of these three significant elements, that is place, memory, and identity, create some sort of identity of a refugee, which is absolutely tied to the lost homeland of a refugee. And I would also try to juxtapose another identity that is completely opposite to the other identity, that is by the refugee, by the subject refugee, which is actually created out of positioning the subject refugee in a transnational space. Right? So finally, I would try to sort of talk to you how a refugee caught between a transnational identity and the identity of a homeland, right, tries to negotiate these two identities, and absolutely finally not being able to take any position, caught between what I call it as a liminal position. So that is largely the contour of my paper today. So to begin with, if you look at the idea of refugee and the subject refugee put, there are quite a number of research have been done on exploring refugee and how actually refugee as a subject has been looked at in various perspectives. People have looked at it from the identity, people have looked at it from the perspective of statelessness and other things. But when we try to locate the subject refugee in a transnational space, the problem actually emerges is that often, most often than not, the subject refugee group is actually confused between diaspora and exile. There's another category called the internally displaced. So I'm not going to go into the internally displaced one. I'm basically trying to look at the subject refugee group caught in the existential dilemma of exile, right? And how it actually tries to create an identity for itself. Right? So, if you look at this the idea of a subject of refugee, what actually comes up, especially from 1950s onwards, to be more precisely, the kind of refugee discourse has been emerging in a much more pronounced manner, especially starting with the Palestinian loss of homeland, the formation of the Israel state in 1948, and after that, a lot of Vietnam conflict, and of course, Sri Lankan Tamil conflict, and the present day Syrian conflict. So all these geopolitical conflicts have produced lakhs and lakhs of refugees. They cross their borders, and sometimes they are caught in the pockets. They are moving between the pockets. Right? So we get to hear a lot of news on social media, also in newspapers and all these things. Refugees are actually halted in European countries before they get into the country. So there is a United Nations High Commission for Refugees that started in 1951, and that tried to define the idea of refugee and all these things. But the problem remains till date unsolved, in the sense that when we try to sort of look at both from the perspective of refugee literature and more precisely from the perspective of refugee studies, in academical, the subject has been very heavily theorized. But the problem is the theorization mostly revolves on the idea of the subject refugee caught between the borders, and in fact trying to move into the terrain of the host country for their livelihood and other things. Right? So the kind of the autobiographies, because at the end of my talk, I would also try to demonstrate this argument, how the subject refugee could caught between transnational identity and the identity of enforced identity, that is something that the refugee group which is actually enforced upon the thing. So moving on to this idea of the kind of the refugee group, what happens in the 1950s, especially lots and lots, as I said earlier, the countries have produced lots and lots of refugees, especially Palestine, Syria, and Sri Lanka. And of course, the entire, especially if you look at the entire Middle East, in present day Yemen and all these things. So in the late 1980s, they produced quite a number of refugee subjects. The problem is they found there is a sort of a liminal space that the place that they went into, especially in the case of Palestinian refugees, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and in the case of even Syrian refugees who were trying to sort of enter into the European countries, they found that they were not well accommodated. Though we have lots and lots of refugee camps in the late 1980s established for Palestinians. And also for Syrian refugees in the Middle East, and some of the European countries. The problem is they were not actually, they felt that they were not accommodated. Though we have this UNRW, United Nations Relief and Work Agency, which took care of this entire Palestinian and this Syrian and Lebanon refugee issues, and they felt that they were not properly sort of accommodated. The issue basically arises because of their identity. As I said earlier, they hang on to their place. They hold on to their collective memory, what Foucault says, counter memory. They say that their existence is basically a resistance, the existence itself as a resistance. And of course, their idea of identity. So their identity, which is created out of place, that is basically their own lost land or their lost homeland, and the memory, which is a collective memory. I primarily call it as a collective memory because in the case of Palestinians, they go back to the 1948 incident, which is called as Al-Nakba in Arabic, which means catastrophe, the year in which they lost their homeland. Also, they go back to their 1967, another catastrophe when actually the entire Israel basically occupied the whole land of actually Palestine, in the case of Palestine. If you look at in the case of Sri Lankan refugees, what happens is basically, as we know, that there was a long-standing conflict from the middle of the mid of 1950s till 2009 between Singles and Tamils. They lost their the Tamils were fighting for their Elam, that is basically a separate state, and thousands of Tamils were brutally murdered, and lakhs of Tamilians migrated to India, Canada, and Australia and other countries. Right? So the thing is that how refugee as a subject negotiates with what I basically call this transnational identity. That is, having caught up in a refugee boat, carrying the burden of the identity of an exile, right? And also not being able to find at home, this is one hand. On the other hand, as I said earlier, as they were completely uprooted from their own homeland, they carry the collective memory that is pre-conflict, pre-geopolitical conflict period, wherein they had a very, very harmonious and very, very peaceful sort of a life.
Just a second, Dr. Bhupati. Your voice is wobbling a bit. If you can do anything about that.
Yeah, am I audible now?
You are audible, but it's a bit vague. I mean, it's wobbling a bit. If you could adjust the microphone.
Yeah, now I'm actually trying to adjust. Is it fine now?
It's fine now.
Yeah, okay. So, sorry for the
I'm sorry to intervene. I'm Subhajit Sengupta. I believe that if the other participants mute themselves, the sound could improve. So could the organizers ask the other participants to mute them?
From my end, I don't see any problem here. Because I think my connection is also pretty stable. Yeah. May I continue?
Yes, please carry on. Please carry on.
Sorry for the interruption. Yeah. So I was just trying to tell you that how a subject, the refugee subject, one side carrying the transnational identity. We all know very well that transnational identity of a refugee, which is diametrically opposite of, let's say, a voluntary diasporic identity. Right? The transnational identity literally does not give them any sort of an identity to hold on. And this is one hand. On the other hand, if you try to juxtapose their own original identity, which is lost when they were uprooted from their homeland, but metaphorically, as well as emotionally, they try to create that identity based on the kind of symbolic association that they try to have with the place. In the case of Palestinian, the stone, their buildings, the kind of things like olive tree, the flowers, the field that they left behind, and this one hand. On the other hand, the kind of a collective memory, the memory which they actually tend to carry, then they tend to pass on to the second generation of, let's say, refugees, their own children. Right? So together, I basically argue the place and memory together constitute what we call the original identity of Palestinians. So now, the subject refugee code caught between the transnational, I would say, enforced identity and the original identity, which is obviously not possible given the political turmoil that they undergo, negotiates between these two identities, transnational and the original identity, because they cannot claim their original identity. Right? So this is one hand. And on the other hand, if we try to look at the subject position, cut out of this, are constructed out of this set of a liminality, what I would call it as a liminality, and how it tries to, let's say, express itself. So I'm trying to sort of demonstrate this argument in three texts. Actually, I have chosen. One is by a Syrian writer, and two are obviously by a Palestinian writer. First, let me take up the Syrian text, which was written in 2015 by Sarmar Yazbek. The title of the text is "The Crossing: My Journey Towards the Heart of Syria." So, the Sarmar Yazbek, she's a very she's a political writer who was detained for participating in the 2011 Arab Spring, also in the conflict, the Syrian conflict, and she moved to Paris. Now she is trying to enter in 2015 into the land of Syria. And what kind of problem that she faces, what kind of, I would say, identity crisis that she feels when she is trying to enter, when she is actually stopped at the border Right? So one hand, see, he has a sort of, I would say, not so well-founded, well-grounded, I would say, French identity. On the other hand, she is having, let's say, a supposedly original identity of being a Syrian, but she is not being able to enter into the land of Syria. Her text is a telling account of what kind of, let's say, emotional turmoil that she faces. So that is what I basically call it as a liminal position. Obviously, going by the Syrian identity, Syrian refugee, Syrian citizenship, she has a memory, strong memory of having left her homeland, strong memory of being emotionally attached to the place in which she lived in Syria. And on the other hand, though she lived in, let's say, in Paris, she's living in Paris for, let's say, more than 5 years. Back in 2015, she could not, let's say, own, nor she is able to claim that, let's say, imposed identity. That's a transnational identity. So this is the very important thing I just want to tell you. Another text I just want to sort of demonstrate is a text written by Fawaz Turki in 1988. The title of the text is Soul in Exile, Lives of a Palestinian Revolutionary. The text was written, as I said, in 1988. So Fawaz Turki was exiled from his homeland, Palestine, when he was 8 years old. He to actually Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, and he faced quite a number of refugee issues, living in the refugee camp and not being happy over there. Again, moved to Australia, moved to Paris. Still, he is actually carrying the memory, carrying the identity. So just look at it. He was exiled from his homeland at the age of 8, but still, for he says in his autobiography, for 4 decades I was carrying. That was in 1988. He says, for 4 decades I was carrying the identity of Palestinian. Though I do not have a passport, wherever he goes, whatever the airport he lands, he is constantly questioned, he is constantly ridiculed, and he is constantly seen as a terrorist because he was saying that he is a Palestinian. Number one. And number two, since he is a refugee, he does not have the passport. Therefore, he is put into a lot of harassment in the borders. So the point I'm trying to make is that the refugee court, though having been theorized in the refugee studies as a transnational subject, does not really guarantee, let's say, a safer zone, a safer identity for refugees. On the other hand, the kind of a memory and place out of which they construct their original identity really does not provide them with any sort of guarantee to claim their lost identity. Okay? And yeah, so now I have another 2 minutes to go. I'll just sort of quickly walk you through Najla Syed's very important autobiography. She's the daughter of Edward Syed. Though Edward Syed has also he also has a very pronouncing text out of place, but I just want to take Najla Syed because he is a second generation Palestinian. Her text was written in 2013. The title itself is very intriguing. The title of her text is Looking for Palestine, Growing Up Confused in an Arab American Family. This is a very important text because this text advances the argument I made. And she almost, she has an American citizenship. And still, she does not feel at home. She's a second generation, she was born and brought up in America. But still, she does not feel at home. She constantly searches for her identity of a Palestinian. Right? And she says, one side, the Arab identity at home, another side, American identity in the educational institutions, in the school, later at college and Princeton University. So she carries this sort of ambivalent identity. And she is not able to, as he says, she is not able to claim any of this identity. Right? So and she also says that when she till she went to the 9th standard, she was not even aware of where was Lebanon. Right? So look at this situation. She is a daughter of a good side, and still, as he also says, still she went to Princeton, still she discussed with her friends about the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. She wasn't really aware of, let's say, Israel-Palestine conflict. So this apart. So what, as I said, if you look at these three texts I have just sort of cited here, these three texts quite invariably call for the kind of what we call, or rather I would say, demonstrates the kind of a limbo or liminal-like situation of refugee, okay? Caught in, let's say, caught between transnational and the homeland, and neither of the identities trying to, let's say, bestow them with any of the subject position. Okay? So I'm trying to sort of, in a way that my paper tries to foreground this, as I said in the beginning, the subjecthood of a refugee. How it basically, in a way, one side not being really able to claim the transnational identity, and the other side not being, let's say, able and assert the original identity of a homeland, though the later, especially the latter one, was quite still indeed is quite prominent in many of the almost all of the life narratives, if you read, be it the Syrian life narratives or Sri Lankan life narratives, even Palestinian life narratives. But politically, it is not viable given the geopolitical conflict around the corner. So with this, I'll wind up. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And if there is any question, I will be happy to take it in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhupate, for that interesting paper. Dr. Bhupate spoke about transnationalism in the context of refugeehood, referring particularly to Palestinian narratives. And we'll take questions at the end of both the papers. First, I'll ask Dr. Abhishek Parvi from IIT Madras to make his presentation. And after that, I'll make brief observations on both the presentations before we take questions. So, Dr. Parvi, good afternoon. And are you ready, Dr. Parvi?
I am indeed. I am, yes.
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Parvi. We had met in Bardhawan. Do you recognize me?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. Yes. It's good to see you again.
I think that was last December.
Indeed,
yes. Wonderful.
Yes.
Please, go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sangupta. It's good to see you again, albeit virtually. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhupati, for what was a really interesting session. And I'm going to draw a lot on the presentation in terms of connecting that to what I will talk about in my very brief talk about post-colonial identities and memory studies. So I work in memory studies. It's something I do theoretically, and I try to connect that as a discipline in terms of how it can inform readings of literature, literary text, cultural text, etc. So my presentation will be quite theoretical, although I will draw on certain literary texts as examples, as case studies. But what I will limit myself to in this very brief session is to look at the possibilities of memory studies in terms of offering potentially newer readings from the post-colonial perspective. Now, first things first, we need to take a look at memory studies from an interdisciplinary lens. I mean, it's a very organically interdisciplinary spectrum of studies. So one obvious perspective in memory studies is a psychological lens. And what I do in my research is try to connect the psychological lens to a more macro, extended cultural lens. So in other words, I look at memory as a neural phenomenon, as a psychological phenomenon, as a micro phenomenon, but also memory as a macro phenomenon, as a social, cultural, extended phenomenon. So I think part of the challenge, as well as the rewards of memory studies, is looking at the interface between these two narratives of memory, so to speak. The micro narrative, the micro embedded psychological neural narrative and the macro extended cultural narrative, right? So one of the things which we know in memory studies today through scientific research is, we need to take a look at certain cognitive categories as not opposite categories, but rather connected categories. So for example, we do know from psychological research today that memory and forgetting are not really cognitive opposites of each other. They're actually cognitive components of each other. They inform each other in very complex cognitive ways. So in other words, if we are to remember something, or any act of remembering would also entail by default an act of forgetting or processes of forgetting. So certain traces must be forgotten in order for certain traces to be consolidated and replayed over and over again through textual forms, material forms, etc., cultural forms, architectural forms, etc. So any act of remembrance or any act of remembering, I'm using remembering with a hyphen away, yeah, must also entail little micro acts of forgetting. So what that means is, at a very core psychological level, forgetting becomes a component of remembering. And we all know through sort of cultural studies research, trauma research, literary studies research, and I think Dr. Bhupati touched on this as well in his very interesting presentation, that every culture, if you look at culture as a phenomenon, culture as a process, will also include processes of forgetting. So every culture entails forgetting. In other words, every culture has sort of compulsory oblivion to a certain extent. Every culture must proceed through oblivion to a certain extent. So every culture requires remembering. Every culture requires replaying of certain identities, certain events, certain monuments, etc. But equally, every culture should also be able to forget certain events and move on in terms of how it organizes and designs its own narrative. So if you look at culture as a narrative category, which we do in memory studies, that narrative category entails an entanglement, shall we say, between remembering and forgetting. So these are like simultaneous activities in terms of how every culture proceeds through a narrative process, a textual process, a metonymic process, a material process. And we also know, at the moment I use the word metonymy, we also know that every act of remembrance is metonymic in quality in terms of being fragmented. So there's no such thing as total recall. So the human memory or cultural memory is essentially a fragmented, incomplete metonymic process. And again, we are looking at this very interesting relationship between consolidation and omission. So certain events are consolidated by replaying, reiterating, redesigning, etc. But also certain events and figures are omitted. So this, again, this very interesting relationship between omission and consolidation is something which we find in memory as a cultural category, as a collective category, in terms of how a nation remembers, in terms of how a collective remembers, in terms of how a state would want ideally for the collective to remember. And we can think of many examples in fiction and partition fiction closer to home, and Milan Kundera's fiction looking at post-communist Eastern Europe, and also the Palestinian fiction that Dr. Bhupati talked about, how certain events are forgotten conveniently by the state, and how the traces of those events reside in a very micro domains, such as literature, conversations, gossip, oral narratives, or even through very material markers, such as domestic artifacts, etc. So I look at domestic artifacts very seriously, especially in relation to how it connects to post-colonial identities. Because one of the things about post-colonial criticism is the difference between the macro and the micro narratives must be deconstructed. So in terms of understanding how a certain culture remembers, looking at monuments and archives are not enough. Looking at oral narratives, looking at little objects, small objects, domestic objects, intimate objects become very, very important. So again, we're looking at a very interesting relationship between intimacy and discursivity, right? And one, I mean, you can think of any number of examples in looking at diaspora literature, post-colonial literature. For example, Jhumpa Lahiri's fiction is full of intimate objects, very domestic objects, homely objects, objects in the kitchen, objects in the drawing room, objects in the bedroom, and how those objects become markers of memory in ways that a more macro commemoration will not be able to sort of accommodate. For example, the very domestic objects, the very intimate objects, intimate markers of memory in Jhumpa Lahiri's fiction become more important sometimes than a more statist, a more macro, and a more official record of memory. So what I'm trying to say, I suppose, in this session is, if we look at post-colonial identity formation, as a category, as an epistemic category, as a psychological category, and also as a political category. But memory studies play a very key role in terms of offering this very interesting interface between consolidation and omission, and looking at consolidation and omission as connected activities. And obviously, these are very political activities. I mean, what is forgotten is obviously very political. So there are processes informing forgetting. So I suppose one takeaway that we can have from looking at this intersection between memory studies and post-colonial studies is looking at forgetting as a profoundly political activity, forgetting as something which is almost an agentic activity. So forgetting something becomes an act of agency. Sometimes the agency can be controlled by the state, as in Kundera, and sometimes the agency can be controlled by but a subject, and also not willing to forget becomes a very important part in the entire post-colonial discourse, that you refuse to forget or refuse to reject through forgetting. So if you look at forgetting as an act of rejection, you're rejecting a certain identity and trying to move on to a new narrative of identity. A refusal to forget also becomes an agentic activity in terms of I will force myself to remember it as a very micro subject, which undercuts in some sense the control, the narrative, the hegemonic narrative of the state. Now, there are many theories we can look at, but I think what we do in memory studies and what I'm interested in doing in terms of looking at the intersection of memory studies and post-colonial identities is to look at the interstitial quality of identity in post-colonial studies. And we have a very rich research on that already, from Homi Bhabha to Spivak to, and you can also use the more post-structuralist lens in terms of looking at how identities are produced, deproduced, and reproduced constantly and complexly in post-colonial conditions. How streets are renamed, how buildings are renamed, how old names are brought back in terms of connecting to certain ideological impulses at certain points of time. And what we can do in terms of mapping memory studies into post-colonial studies is to look at the politics of renaming, the politics of remembering, and the politics of de-remembering as very political activities. So again, we're looking at this very complex collusion, shall we say, between psychology and ideology, between psychological studies and political studies, in terms of how certain street names are renamed again, in terms of bringing back some rich legacy from the pre-colonial period. And we can think of any examples, from any city in the world, I suppose. Mumbai, Calcutta, any place in the world will supply enormous or ample examples in terms of how, urban geography can be a very rich site, a very rich text in terms of looking at how monuments, buildings, public spaces are renamed, forgotten, abandoned, in terms of how that connects to a broader discourse between memory and post-colonial identities. Now, what I suppose is interesting in this kind of a research is looking at oblivion as a very rich category. Oblivion, as I mentioned, as a political category, as not something which just happens passively, but as something which is actively produced. In other words, what I'm suggesting is the production of oblivion, oblivion as a productive activity, oblivion as an agentic activity, amnesia as a productive activity, in terms of how a certain state or a certain subject chooses to forget or chooses to unremember. And that becomes a very interesting idea as well. And I was listening to Dr. Bhupati's session in terms of how identities which are political, linguistic, cultural inequality, they rely on this entanglement between forgetting and remembering all the time. So what is asked to be forgotten by the state, for example, by the controlling apparatus, and the refusal to forget that can become a political refusal, can become an act of subversion in some sense. So again, we're looking at memory as a subversive quality, or the refusal to forget as a subversive quality. Now, if you take all this and try to sort of map it into post-colonial studies in a way we look at it today, I think what immediately becomes interesting and very visible is it makes this the post-structuralist, post-colonial identity a richer spectrum in some sense. Because if you're looking at memory and forgetting, not as passive, passive things which happen to the subject, but as active things which the subject makes happen. So in other words, we're looking at memory and forgetting as active processes, which are quite post-structuralist, which are quite performative in quality as well. So if you're looking at the performance of remembering and the performance of forgetting at a micro level, as well as at a collective level, what it immediately does is it makes the entire discourse of post-colonial identities a richer discourse to look at. Because identity, of course, as you all know, very cognitively and complexly and almost organically related to memory in terms of how certain identities are remembered and replayed and reiterated. So every identity is an act of reiteration. We know that through Homi Bhabha, through Spivak, through Derrida, through all kinds of post-structuralist, post-colonial theorists. So every identity is a process of reiteration. And it's the reiterative quality of identity sort of brings in a sense of plasticity, right? And so this plasticity is important because we're also looking at plasticity as a neural category, as a psychological category, in terms of how the brain as a plastic phenomenon, how the brain as a plastic activity. So, this is what modern neuroscience tells us, that we need to take a look at the brain not as a passive object, but as a plastic phenomenon, something which is happening all the time. So neural plasticity is a big deal in psychological cognitive studies today. Now, if you take that neural plasticity and map that onto, let us say, the plasticity of remembering and forgetting in terms of macro activities, in terms of architectural activities, in terms of urban geographical activities or urban ethnographic activities. So immediately we find lots of interfaces coming up in terms of how cities are planned, deplanned, replanned, constructed, deconstructed, reconstructed, in a very Derridian way as well, in terms of how renaming of monuments happen, renaming of streets happen, and how every act of renaming, every act of remembering also simultaneously entails an act of forgetting. So when you rename a particular street, trying to go back to a pre-colonial time or maybe a post-colonial time, underlining the post-colonial time, you're also simultaneously asking the subject to forget something. And again, asking to forget becomes almost an apparatus in some sense, right? And we can say, sort of immediately see how the post-colonial and the cognitive are beginning to blend in some sense. So I suppose one of the things which we need to do in memory studies today is to look at all these different kinds of markers. And by markers, I mean text, literary text, cultural text, monuments, architecture, streets, urban geography, ethnography, identities, because identity is obviously a very entangled phenomenon. Identity is biological, identity is also ideological, and identity is also very plastic. And identities change all the time in terms of how the location of the subject is subject to change, depending on the discursive apparatus around the subject at any given point of time. So when the discursive apparatus changes, what also happens is certain modes of memory and certain modes of oblivion come into play with each other. And one particular theorist that I find very helpful in terms of looking at memory studies from a post-structuralist lens is Catherine Malabou. So Malabou's reading of plasticity, Malabou's reading of the event, Malabou's reading of the accident, it comes from a very strong philosophical tradition. She's a Derrida scholar, but at the same time, she also works in cognitive studies in a very straightforward, in a very complex way. Sorry, not straightforward, very complex way in terms of looking at brain plasticity, neural plasticity, not just as embedded phenomenon, but also in terms of how that situates the subject as an extended phenomenon. So I think what memory studies does very well, and I at least I think that's probably the potential and the future for memory studies in the way we look at it today, is to see how memory can become a very fluid activity, which is cognitive, embedded, corporeal, micro neural in category, but also at the same time extended inactive in category. And this constant loop, shall we say, between the embedded quality of memory and the inactive quality of memory is what connects memory as a phenomenon, memory as a process. It makes it cultural in quality, it makes it collective in quality, it makes it political in quality, it makes amnesia political in quality. For example, if we take a look at a literary text like The Book of Laughter and Forgetting by Milan Kundera, where certain events are conveniently forgotten and then resurrected depending on the change in political will, the ideological impulse at any given point of time. Now, what the subject does in terms of the changes, and Kundera obviously gives extreme examples of how events and names are forgotten and then brought back and remembered and then demembered, and then they sort of stay as some kind of a spectral presence. And again, spectrality is a very important category in memory studies. So spectrality in terms of not just, as a psychological phenomenon, also as an architectural, physical phenomenon, haunted buildings, abandoned buildings, buildings left by time, buildings which are once important, but then abandoned by time. And again, I'm very interested in the idea of abandoned. So something gets abandoned, something gets left by time. So in a sense, that gets forgotten, but then at the same time, it also becomes a residual reservoir of a certain kind of memory, which can be potentially subversive in quality. And that obviously connects very interestingly to Derrida's idea of spectrality and also hauntology, the haunted ontology, something which is there as an ontic quality, but in a haunted way, something which doesn't quite go away. And of course, we in literary studies, we take a lot of pleasure and happiness in terms of the metaphor Derrida uses for his ontological condition. He uses an example of Hamlet's father, as we all know, the ghost which doesn't go away, which is there as some kind of spectral, ontological, residual presence. And this residual quality, spectral quality of identity is something, I think, which can be foregrounded in a very interesting and cognitively complex ways in memory studies, especially in terms of how it looks at post-colonial identities. And again, I'm using post-colonial as a temporal quality, post-colonial, something which comes after the colonial condition, but also post-colonial as a symptomatic cultural quality, as a textual quality. And in both sense, I think memory studies can play a very, very important role, not just in terms of the postmodern unreliable memory, which we see in Salman Rushdie, Martin Amis, Gunter Grass, etc., where you have this unreliable narration, which is undercutting the status narration of a nation, of a cultural identity, etc., that is already there, that's already pervasive in post-colonial fiction, but also in terms of how the whole idea of identity becomes a fluid phenomenon, also becomes a temporal phenomenon, something which comes after. And again, we are looking at this very Derridan idea of the after as a belated identity, an identity which is always invested in time, invested in terms of how you remember, how you unremember, and how you re-remember in certain senses. So memory, just to wind up, as you all know, is a profoundly political activity. And what we should do in memory studies today is look at how the psychological, hardcore, neuroscientific idea of memory and forgetting can be mapped in a very interesting sense to a study of memory as an identity process, which we see in post-colonial criticism and postmodern criticism all the time. So with that, I wind up, but I'm happy to take questions and also have a dialogue with Dr. Bhupati if time permits and the chair so wishes. Thank you very much for your attention.
You have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself.
Dr. Sengupta is already unmuted, I think.
Sir, in that case, please unplug your audio device, your microphone, your headphone. You first unplug, then plug in it again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, yes, I'll first talk about Dr. Bhupati's paper. He spoke about the refugee subject positioned in a transnational space, referring particularly to Palestinian narratives. And he explored in the course of his presentation the ways in which refugeehood negotiates with different identities, the identity enforced by the place traveled to and the original identity. And the focus was on crossing borders and on formations of identity. Now, postmodern hybridity emphasizes not really acts of convergence or acts of fusion, but it emphasizes multiple positionings. And these multiple positionings, which are very mobile, are created by a kind of transgression of not only borders, but also of earlier modernist grand narratives. And this transgression is very performative. It's embedded, so to speak, in the very act of crossing borders as refugees. And this leads to the formation of multiple voices, diverse identities, and even diverse national voices. And there could be attempts to stabilize ethnic, racial, and national identities, but such attempts are likely to fall apart because there's always the pressure of multiple interfaces among cultures and nations and identities and languages and customs. And postmodern identity, therefore, is something that's generated when these differences of nation and class and gender and language are articulated. As the refugees travel, and in the process of traveling, they move across gaps. And this is also characteristic of the diasporas, but of course, the refugees, the thing is a trifle different. We bring in the question of liminality, for example, which we, and the refugees always are on the margins. The case could be argued differently for the diasporas. Now, the refugees also, or refugeehood also implies the inclusion of certain kinds of alliances in the long run. Even while there are contradictions and paradoxes, there could be political readings and misreadings. There could be failures of articulation. Now, all these are part and parcel of the very idea of refugeehood. And I'd like Dr. Bhupathi to very briefly, because there will be other questions, I'm sure, to very briefly respond to these few observations that I have made. Dr. Bhupathi, could you please?
Thank you, Professor Sagupta, for your very enlightening comment. I would like to argue that if you tend to, let's say, look at refugee from the perspective of postmodernism, again, the problem comes up that the idea of refugee does not really, as you also said in your comment, really fall into any of the national identities. They are obviously in the periphery. So when they are in the periphery, obviously postmodernism looks at everything as sort of fragments. But again, these refugees are called as, they are actually mobile bodies. They constantly sort of move. They constantly on the move. So postmodernism looks at only the sort of the fixed identity, in the sense that the fixed identities, like, let's say, for example, let's take the example of tribals, disabled, and let's say we'll take up the example of Dalits. So these are blood. So these identities are fixed identities. They know what is their identity. But in the case of refugees, obviously there are a lot of intersections within the refugee subject itself. What about women with the refugee? Let's say a child with the refugee, a disabled person with the refugee. So they argue in the refugee studies that they are saying that this the kind of postmodern understanding of refugee does not really help us understand the sort of liminal subject position of a refugee, because this subject position tries to constantly negotiate, also navigate through these fragmented identities, but certainly not falling into any of these fragments, because all these fragments are constantly pushing this subject position of a refugee to be assimilated. That is exactly the problem, and that is why in refugee studies they actually call for postmodern understanding of a refugee, as in completely a borderless, completely sort of a stateless, nationless sort of a place. Obviously, it is indeed a very utopian sort of a thing, but at least in academically, they're trying to sort of theorize the terminology postmodern subject position of a refugee. Taking the other one, that's the kind of a hybrid or multicultural identity. So we all know very well that refugee, as I said earlier, doesn't really fall into any of the categories we yourself meant. But the issue is that when we look at refugee subjects from a multicultural perspective, even when I just cited Najla Sayed's one, she was born there, born in USA, brought up in USA, studied there, but still, almost after, let's say, 30 years, 35 years, she's trying to say that she's still looking for a root. That is, the title itself says, looking for Palestine. So, and growing up confused in an Arab American family. So, in the sense that she is not really able to, let's say, she has a citizenship, she has a very, very safe life. Right? But then she's not able to, in a way, claim that particular identity of being an American. And similarly, she doesn't have any recourse to sort of fall on the Palestinian identity, because this Palestinian identity is completely, in a way, pushes her into the periphery, says that you don't belong there, because you have never seen the place, you don't have any sort of a memory. So what I'm saying is the kind of transmuted memory from one generation to another generation, that itself is a very fascinating sort of study, because the translation of a memory has to be, as Dr. Parvi was trying to argue, has to be looked at from the perspective of this idea of, let's say, borderless, transnational, and what they call it in the refugee studies, post-transnational perspectives. So I hope I sort of try to address it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that response, Dr. Bhupati. Now, Dr. Abhishek Parvi spoke about memory studies and post-colonial identities in a very fascinating way. He said that every culture proceeds through acts of not just remembering the past, but also through acts of deliberately forgetting elements of the past. And every act of remembering, he said, is a metonymic process. And what we remember is always a fragment. And he spoke of the relationship between intimacy and discursivity, referring to the ways in which domestic objects become markers of memory. And memory, he said, is also something that has a manipulative function, which is simultaneously subversive and also consolidating in the post-colonial situation. And identities are reproduced very complexly, he said, in the post-colonial situation. He spoke of the renaming of cities and streets and spoke of urban geography. And he said that forgetting the colonial past can be an act of political control. It is something that can be seen as a deliberate act of subversion. And he also related memory and post-colonial identity with ideology and psychology. Very fascinating indeed, Dr. Parvi. Just one question for you. What about historiography, the writing of history? And do you think that the writing of history, suppose someone is writing a history book on the British rule in India, does it challenge, resist in certain ways the deliberate acts of forgetting, the renaming of streets, the removal of colonial structures? And we also have the Archaeological Society of India trying to preserve some of those colonial structures, even while cities are being renamed, streets are being renamed. The way we dress, some of the things that we do, the English that we speak, they all are remnants of colonialism. And I think it's also an act of resistance, therefore, that we are engaging in, even as we find these deliberate attempts to forget and to remove the past, so to speak. So yes, the writing of history, I mean, the books that students study when they study history, the research that researchers do when they engage with history, and the very idea of history, the very idea of writing history and interpreting history, seems to cut across the grain of these deliberate acts of forgetting. Of course, history is also ideologically, politically controlled. I agree with that. There could be certain things that are deliberately excluded from the writing of history. And yes, of course, I totally agree with you when you say that we remember only fragments of the past, and we can never have access, as the new historicists would argue, or even some of the cultural anthropologists like Clifford Geertz would argue, we can never have access to a complete and uninterrupted past. That's, of course, absolutely impossible by all means. So we have access to only things that are textualized. For example, if you think of a piece of pottery in a museum gallery as a text to be looked at and studied and interpreted, that becomes a marker of a certain way of life. that stays back as a residue of the past that has gone by. Something that's written about in a book. It's not always necessarily a history book, but even a work of fiction, it can be a book where elements of the past are textualized. So the past survives in such fragments, in such shreds and patches. But yes, the question that I have for you is, do you think the writing of history is an act of resistance in some ways, if not entirely, to the the deliberate acts of forgetting that you spoke about, even necessary acts of forgetting? Yes,
Yeah.
Dr. Parvi.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Sam. It was fascinating. Thank you for for studying my session so well. It was very, very enriching the way you talked about it. And your question is very, very valid and fascinating, really, because we know that historiography has a meta-textual quality to it. You're writing a history about history in some sense, right? So that immediately makes it metacognitive. So it's like cognition about cognition, knowledge about knowledge, in terms of how you process knowledge, how you control knowledge. So therein lies the potentially deconstructed possibility, as you very correctly pointed out, in terms of how, if you look at knowledge as a cognitive category, and if you're writing a book of knowledge, in terms of how history is processed and formed, that itself will in a way expose, in some sense, as you very correctly pointed out, the deliberate omissions and the deliberate replaying of certain things over and over again. So that itself makes it complicated, as a textual activity. But if you just take a look at memory from a very hardcore neural perspective for lay people like us, what we know today is that memory happens through three processes. One is encoding, the other is consolidation, and the third is retrieval. These are like sequential processes. So for any experience has to be encoded in a brain, and then it has to be consolidated and then retrieved. Now, if you take this model, so to speak, and apply it to, let's say, historiography, history writing, encoding becomes a very political activity in some sense. So how do you encode a particular event in terms of how do you textualize it? So again, we're looking at the interface between psychology and cultural studies. So encoding a particular event, encoding a certain text in a way, that itself becomes an act of inclusion and exclusion together. Because the moment you encode something, you are simultaneously including and excluding certain things, right? And then, of course, you consolidate that. You consolidate the entanglement of inclusion and exclusion, and then you retrieve it. So encoding, consolidation, retrieval. So if you take that sort of psychological process and map it onto how cultures remember and forget, you find that the process of encoding itself will have a textual metonymic quality, as we both agree, in terms of how certain chips are chipped off, in terms of how certain things are consolidated over and over again. Now, we also know it actually gets more complicated because through psychological studies today, again, from a very general idea of psychology that we have today, we are looking at a model of memory which tells us that when we remember something, we never remember the original event. We actually remember the last remembered version of that event. So again, we're looking at a textual quality of memory in terms of how memory is not just, the whole ontology of originality disappears from memory. So memory becomes a text, memory becomes an encoded text, and every act of remembering is a recall of the last version that is saved in some sense. So you're looking at a slippage in a very Derridian kind of a way, even in the way the brain functions. Now, historiography, as you brilliantly pointed out, it takes a metacognitive look in terms of how this encoding happens, right? It takes a macro look in terms of how this encoding happens. And in that sense, I completely agree with you when you say that it can potentially foreground this deliberate omissions, slippages, etc. But also we know historiography itself is a textual process. Right. So, historiography itself is a subjective process. It is a subject who's talking about history in some sense. It is a subject who's remembering history in some sense, remembering the writings of history in some sense. So in a way, I agree with you entirely. The historiography as a phenomenon, as a textual activity, can foreground what we just talked about in terms of the slippages, in terms of the omission. But at the end of the day, there's no escape from textuality, is there? Right. So every act of historiographic writing itself becomes a textual process in some sense. So it itself has its own unique omissions and reconsolidations. So in a way, that itself becomes a textual activity. So there's an ambivalence there, I think.
Yes, right. And these interventions between the lived past and the present moment, the moment we're living in, are very significant because, as you pointed out, it's the act of remembering immediately prior to ours that we rely on in large measure. And that's what you were getting at.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Dr. Parvi. Now we can take questions from the participants, the members in the audience.
Dr. Chenkupta, there are quite a few questions in the chat box. Can you access that?
Okay, I'll try.
Can I read it out to you?
That will be helpful. That will be more helpful, yes.
So there is one question from Saibil. He is asking about the agency of forgetting. He's talking about how passion and emotion, sort of a political agency of memory is glued to passion and emotion, and how you would qualify, how that would qualify as an agency of forgetting. That was one question. So I can.
Who is it for? Is it for Dr. Parvi?
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Parvi, could you please respond?
Yeah, sure. It's a very good question because, you know, I should have mentioned the idea of emotion in the entire session, because emotion plays a very cognitive role in remembering. So passion and emotions, these become very important cognitive components, shall we say, any act of forgetting and remembering. So, you know, the cognitive quality of emotions in terms of how it helps us recognize reality better, that becomes a very important deal in memory studies. And now, again, one psychologist that I will mention in reference to this question is someone called Joseph Ledoux, who has a very interesting book called The Emotional Brain. Now, he's a neuroscientist, a hardcore neuroscientist, but he's talking about emotions not just as a cognitive category, not just as an embedded micro-neural category, but also emotion as a sort of collective contagious category. It's how emotions spread in a sort of a viral way, how it sort of passes on and infects, how we all get infected by emotion. And this infection of emotion, in some sense, it determines the way we remember and forget. So, for example, the way we are hardwired to remember a particular event, we only remember it through emotion. So, for example, there's a difference between, let's say, remembering digits and data and numbers and remembering events, because the very ontology of an event will entail emotion to it. And the idea of the event is a very emotional idea. The engagement is a very emotional engagement. So any memory of an event will contain, again, the encoding of emotions, so to speak. So that encoding of emotion determines processes of forgetting and remembering. And at least me, as a student of memory studies, I take passions very seriously in terms of how passions become contagious collective category, in terms of how that creates memory of events which had happened, also memory of events which may not have happened, but may just exist at a level of the passion and emotion. And again, we are looking at emotions and passions, as Dr. Sangutta pointed out, as potentially manipulative medium. So memory has a manipulative quality to it as well, especially when it enters public discourse, especially when it enters, and we all know the brain can play tricks with the mind as well. The brain can also play tricks with the self. You can have false memory, quasi-remembering. That's psychologically, scientifically possible. But I think what we are more interested in is looking at the macro versions of false remembering, which operate sometimes purely through passion in terms of remember events, and remembrance spreads in a spectrum which is collective, ideological, discursive in quality, but events which may not have happened. And that can be potentially violent, that can be potentially, and we have numerous examples across the world of collective activities based on remembering things which never took place, right? So passion and emotions play a very key cognitive role, not just in an embedded neural way, but also in an extended discursive function. So I completely agree with the speaker and the person who asked the question. Thank you.
Could we have the next question?
Okay. Pratyush Padhi asks whether forgetting works as a mechanism like displacement. Like he's asking in the context of Ishiguro's The Unconsoled.
Yes, and is it addressed to me or Dr. Bhupathi?
I think to both of you, because it doesn't address mention.
Just come again the question of second. Forgetting.
Yes. Pratyush Pathi asks if forgetting works as a mechanism like displacement, like in the novel of Ishiguro's The Unconsoled.
So, Dr. Parul, you want to go first? Or?
No, Dr. Guru, you go first, please.
Okay, all right. So, yes, so I will respond to this question from the perspective of refugee studies. So, with the point of Dr. Parul will talk to you from the perspective of memory studies. So, if you look at this idea of forgetting, and which is actually tied with the idea of displacement. So, I would in a way differ with the person who has asked this question, because what happens in the sort of with actually refugees is that once they are displaced and once they are dispossessed of their identity of their place, the only thing that is left to them is basically the memory. So what they say is that when one person very he has very sort of rightly has said it that people, especially refugees, have tried to forget. I mean, in fact, they have forgotten to forget the memories in the sense that so they even after they are displaced, as I said in my presentation also, they hang on to their memory. So it is almost, it is in fact impossible for them to forget. So I want to draw, let's say, a very fascinating book by Norman Dormis. It was written in 1982. So the title of the book is Memory for Forgetfulness. So he is actually a prose poem, a very fascinating poem, which was written on the incident that occurred on August 6th of 1982, on the day in which Israeli army attacked Palestinian refugee camp located in Beirut. So he says that he wants a memory to forget his memory. So he has almost forgotten to forget the memory that he actually puts on. So so the idea of forgetting attached to the idea of displacement. That is, when they are displaced, they will actually forget. No, it doesn't happen. In fact, in my presentation, I could not say because I found it was inappropriate to talk about the thing. They, especially the refugees, be it Syrian and Palestinian, or even Palestinian, they use their collective memory to construct their lost history. In the case of Palestinian, there are tens of autobiographies, more than 30, 40 autobiographies that have been translated into English. They use their collective memory, and all of them have been exiled. They use their collective memory to construct the history of Palestine, let's say from the loss of homeland from 1948, because David Ben Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel. He ordered, the moment he became prime minister, he ordered to the historians, Jewish historians, to erase as much as available histories of Palestine as possible and reconstruct the history of, Israelites. So these people cannot actually write the history. They cannot hold on to the history because there was a library in Jerusalem that was burnt. Right? And same is the case with Jaffna. I think in the mid of 1950s, there was a Jaffna library which hosted wonderful archives that was also burnt. So they have no historical, in a way, archives, artifacts to hold on to write their history. They simply relied on their own memory. So that's why I say displacement, but rather I would say strengthen their memory and strengthen the sort of transmutation of the transfer of memory through oral culture from one generation to another generation. Thank you.
Yes, may we have the next question now?
Yes. Anindita Shom asks Dr. Padwi whether he would like to throw some light on the role of memory studies in understanding intergenerational trauma and how do remembering and forgetting play a part in that context.
Intergenerational trauma, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good question. So again, we're looking at memory as a narrative. A narrative which passes on from generation to generation, but also we're looking at memory as an act of consumption, right? You consume a certain narrative, and it's more of a It's more of looking at how the narrative keeps shifting across generation and how each generation consumes it uniquely. So if we look at knowledge and culture, again, as acts of consumption in terms of how certain narratives are prepared and then designed and become almost like commodities, which are then consumed intergenerationally through text. And obviously these consumptions are like edible chronotops in some sense. But what we're looking at here is the idea of knowledge, the idea of memory as an intergenerational narrative, but also that connects to one very key quality about memory, which maybe I should have foregrounded when I was talking about the whole idea of memory in terms of cultural activity. Thanks to this question, I remember that now. How ironical. Anyway, so we need to take a look at memory, not just as a recollection of the past, but also a memory as a way in which that designs our future. So there was this double temporal quality about memory, which is something which keeps getting foregrounded, not just in cultural studies, but also in neurological studies. Because a large part of memory, a large part of the cognitive quality of memory has to do with imagination. Not just about information and retrieval and encoding, that's all there, but also imagination plays a very key cognitive quality, like emotion, in any act of retrieval. Now, imagination, in some sense, is very forward-looking. You imagine something. It has a sort of forward-looking temporal quality. So what we see immediately at a very hardcore cognitive level is that memory has a backward-looking as well as a forward-looking quality in some sense, especially when you have something like intergenerational trauma. Now, how the subject remembers is not just to do with the fact that it wants to restore, it wants to retrieve, it wants to sort of reserve the memory of the past, but also in terms of how it wants to design it for the way it will be consumed subsequently in the future. So memory is an act of consumption. Memory is an act of knowledge production and consumption. It has a lot to do with the forward-looking quality about the medium and the human mind as a medium, the human brain as a medium is a machine which accommodates this double bind of temporality. So it's a very complex temporal machine, the human mind, the human brain, because we are simultaneously able to remember the past as well as situate ourselves in a very act of remembering in the future, right? So the human brain is hardwired to be very complex temporally. Now, if we take that brain system, the human brain system, and make it a more macro thing in terms of how our culture remembers and also sort of shapes its memory processes, it has a very distinct future-looking quality, a very distinct forward-looking quality, which can be aspirational, which can be ideological, which can be utopian. It can be anything depending on the cultural context we're looking at. But it is definitely has a very intergenerational quality. And thanks to this question, it connects to the very complex temporal quality of memory, in which it makes it sort of forward-looking as well, aspirational as well. So memory is not just reminiscing of things which have gone by, but also this very wish-fulfilling quality of a memory makes it aspirational as well, which makes it a very sort of futuristic quality in some sense. So thank you for that question.
I would like to ask Dr. Shenkuto about how many questions you wanted to take.
If I could just,
I mean, for how long could we go on?
Yeah,
that would depend on the organizers.
If I could just request the chair, Dr. Sengupta, I have another meeting.
Okay, so in that case,
with your permission, if we could,
yes, we could wind up in that case because we've already had a few questions. I think there are more questions in the chat box, but we surely can't have time for all those questions. But it's been a fascinating session, and possibly Dr. Bhupati and Dr. Parvi could be got in touch with if the participants wish to have those questions answered, which couldn't be answered today in the session.
Yeah, by all means, yes.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Bhupati, and thank you, Dr. Parvi, for these very interesting papers. And there's always so much to learn. I mean, it's been very, very exciting. An afternoon well spent in your company. And thank you for being here. And I must also thank the organizers for having made this session possible. And so I leave it now to the organizers to wind the session up.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Professor.
Good to meet you.
Thank you. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks for this occasion, and I extend a very hearty thanks to all the speakers and the chair for gracing us with their presence and for sharing with us these wonderful ideas. and your research. So I, on behalf of New Literaria and the entire supporting team, would like to thank Honorable Chair, Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta, and our respected speakers, Dr. Bhupati and Dr. Padwi, along with our audience and guests. Thank you so much. But I would also like to remind you all that we shall resume our program with the next session, which is scheduled to start at 2:40 p.m. after the lunch break. So I would request all of you to stay tuned in. Thank you so much. Thank you, speakers and chair.